Welcome back to our channel. In today's episode, we're diving into one of the darkest and most fascinating stories in the world of Game of Thrones, the tragic rise and fall of Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, and how his madness changed the fate of Westeros forever. Once praised as a promising young ruler, Aerys slowly descended into paranoia, cruelty, and fire-obsessed madness, ultimately bringing an end to the mighty Targaryen Dynasty. But his story didn't end there, because from the ashes of his reign would rise a new dragon, Daenerys Targaryen. Kit bang, but here's the question for you. Do you believe madness truly runs in the blood of dragons? Or was Aerys simply a king destroyed by power and fear? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our future deep dives into epic stories like this. And while you're watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think about the Mad King and the fall of House Targaryen. Now, let's uncover the story. Every house, every king, and every battle has its own truth, a narrative woven from ambition, loyalty, and the cold steel of history. Yet there exist stories far older than the proudest crowns, darker than the deepest night, and more perilous than any sharpened blade. These are the forgotten sagas, never etched into the pages of ancient tomes, but whispered instead to the hungry flames, to the stoic trees that bore witness to forgotten eras, and to the silent dead gods who once held sway over men's fates. Today, with bated breath, we dare to pull back the veil and uncover one such tale, the vast brooding shadow of the Iron Throne, a time when the last great dragons were but fading memories etched in stone, and the Seven Kingdoms trembled with the nascent whispers of rebellion. There once lived a young boy. His name was Aerys, of the venerable House Targaryen, and destiny's cruel hand had already begun to mark him. His hair cascaded like molten silver, shimmering with an ethereal glow, and his eyes, deep as the twilight sky, burned with the ancient violet fire of old Valyria itself. The court, ever prone to flattery and prophecy, murmured that he was born to rule, for the very blood of dragons, potent and untamed, flowed through his veins, and the haunting, majestic songs of his ancestors still seemed to echo within the cavernous halls of the Red Keep. When the aging King Jaehaerys II finally succumbed to the stranger's embrace, the crown, heavy with the weight of generations, passed to his young son. Aerys was barely more than a man then, a vision of youthful promise, handsome and bright, his smile quick to charm, his laughter a cascade of intoxicating hope. To the weary lords of Westeros who had endured years of slow, creeping decay, he seemed a new dawn, brilliant and full of potential. Many called him Aerys the Beautiful, for he adorned himself in silks and gleaming jewels, radiating a splendor reminiscent of the ancient dragon lords themselves. By his side, a constant shadow and steadfast companion, stood Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock. Cold, brilliant, and utterly unflinching, Tywin was everything Aerys both admired and secretly feared. He was a man who bent others to his formidable will without the outward glimmer of a crown, his authority emanating from an innate chilling competence. They had been raised together within the gilded cage of the court, two golden youths, seemingly destined for unparalleled greatness. When Aerys finally ascended to the jagged summit of the Iron Throne, his first decree, made before all assembled, was to name Tywin his hand. "The king and his hand shall rule as one," Aerys declared, his voice ringing with conviction. And for a time, they did. In those first luminous years, the realm blossomed. Tywin's firm, unyielding hand, combined with Aerys's glittering, charismatic charm, formed a perfect, formidable partnership. New roads, ribbons of stone and dirt, were meticulously laid across the kingdoms, ancient debts were meticulously repaid, and a fragile, precious peace cradled the Seven Kingdoms in its tender, unprecedented grasp. The small folk, raising their tankards of ale, toasted their young king, their voices filled with genuine affection, calling him Aerys the Wise. But peace, like the fleeting warmth of summer, is a transient thing, never destined to last forever. Even in those halcyon days, insidious shadows began to stir beneath the polished surface. Aerys's pride, so easily stoked and fed by the adulation of the court, began to hunger insatiably for more. He envied the profound respect that Tywin commanded, the way lords bowed even lower to the hand than to the king himself. Tywin's crimson banners, emblazoned with the roaring lion, seemed to gleam brighter. His feasts were grander, his judgments swifter, more decisive. And though Tywin swore every act was done solely for the glory of the crown, Aerys, cloistered in the Red Keep, began to hear other, more insidious voices. These were the whispering courtiers, the honey-tongued flatterers, the parasites who, with unerring instinct, sensed the nascent weakness festering in the king's heart. "They speak more of Tywin's justice than your own, your grace," they hissed, their words like drops of poison. "It is said the lion sits higher than the dragon." Aerys, ever quick to dismiss such trivialities in the beginning, laughed them off. Tywin was his friend, his brother in all but blood. The notion was absurd, yet the insidious seeds of doubt had been expertly sown, and in the suffocating dark of night they began to take root, twisting and growing. Then came Lady Joanna, Tywin's wife, a woman renowned for her beauty and sharp wit, with a smile that possessed the rare power to soften even Aerys's most volatile moods. Some whispered discreetly that the king had admired her too openly during her years as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Rhaella. Others murmured that the laughter that passed between them had once been too warm, too personal, too charged with unspoken sentiment. When Joanna gave birth to twins, Jaime and Cersei, golden-haired and impossibly perfect, Aerys dutifully sent a raven of congratulations, a perfunctory gesture of royal goodwill. But years later, when she bore her last child, a twisted boy, born small and misshapen, the king unleashed a jest so cruel, so devoid of human empathy that even the most jaded courtiers blanched, their faces paling with shock. "The gods have punished you," Aerys declared, his laughter echoing harsh and brittle throughout the stunned court, "for thinking yourself their equal." In that moment, the fragile edifice of their friendship shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. From that day forward, Tywin's smile became a mask, hard and unyielding as the very stone of Casterly Rock. He continued to perform his duties with relentless precision, but the warmth, the camaraderie that had once bound them was gone, replaced by a glacial distance. The court, sensing the profound rift, began to fracture, some clinging desperately to Tywin's rigid order, others drawn to Aerys's fading, dangerous charm. Queen Rhaella, ever a silent observer, watched the agonizing spectacle unfold, her heart breaking as her husband descended into an abyss of coldness and paranoia, and her son, Prince Rhaegar, grew increasingly distant, lost in his own world of melancholy. Rhaegar was a thoughtful, quiet boy, one who preferred the gentle strumming of a harp to the clang of a sword. "He will be the one to heal the realm," Rhaella whispered to her maids, her voice a raw plea. Not his father. But Aerys, it seemed, wanted no healer. He craved only fire. He began to speak with increasing fervor of dragons once more, of waking them from their slumber within stone. He filled the vast labyrinthine cellars of the Red Keep with barrels upon barrels of wildfire, a dangerously volatile green liquid, claiming it was for the realm's protection. He would spend long, solitary hours alone, staring into the dancing flames of a hearth as if they whispered ancient secrets directly to his ears. And always the whispers of the court followed him, growing bolder, more sinister. He dreams of dragons, he fears Tywin, he grows stranger by the moon. Then one stark winter's morning, news arrived that would irrevocably alter the course of history. Lord Dark said, "I am the king," he declared, rising abruptly from the Iron Throne, its sharp blade surely biting into his flesh. "And the king does not hide behind other swords." Against all sane counsel, against every instinct of self-preservation, he rode to Duskendale with only a small, inadequate escort. What transpired in the dark, twisting streets of that proud, rebellious town, shrouded in treachery and acrid smoke, would not merely break a man, it would irrevocably break the realm itself. For in that crucible of terror and betrayal, the Mad King was truly born. And though no one in Westeros knew it yet, the insidious flames that would ultimately consume the proud Targaryen dynasty had already been lit, burning with a slow, relentless intensity. The dawn that broke over Westeros following Aerys's fateful ride to Duskendale would forever be etched in memory as the day hope itself began to bleed from the realm. The king, in his defiant arrogance, had ridden through the gates of that proud and restless town with only a handful of guards, a foolish display of bravado. The people of Duskendale, grown wealthy on the tides of trade and fierce with their gold-fueled pride, had long chafed under distant rule. When Aerys rode through their streets, resplendent in gleaming armor, there were no cheers, no shouts of welcome, only a chilling, oppressive silence. At first, a fragile pretense of normalcy held. Lord Dennis Darkland, Master of Duskendale, emerged with honeyed words, kneeling before his sovereign and offering a grand feast in his honor. But behind his smooth smiles, the festering wound of rebellion was already suppurating. For the moment, Aerys stepped into the ancient castle of Duskendale. The massive gates clanged shut behind him with a sound like the grave. Steel rang out, swords were drawn with terrifying speed, and the king's own meager guard was brutally cut down before his horrified eyes. Dennis Darkland stepped forward, no longer kneeling, his gaze fixed and menacing. "Forgive me, your grace," he said, his voice trembling with a contained fury, though his hand gripping the hilt of his sword was rock-steady. "But I cannot bend the knee to a tyrant who would bleed us dry." Aerys's own fury, a nascent wildfire, blazed forth. "You dare raise a hand against your king?" he thundered, his voice raw with disbelief. "You will burn for this treason, all of you." But his threats, born of impotent rage, fell on deaf ears. They dragged him down roughly into the cold black dungeons beneath the castle, into a cell where no light, not even the faintest glimmer, could touch the ancient damp walls. The Iron Throne, the symbol of his dominion, was left empty, a silent testament to his folly, and for 6 long, agonizing months, Westeros trembled on the brink. Tywin Lannister's wrath when he learned of the king's capture was a terrible, fearsome thing to behold. He surrounded Duskendale with his vast armies, a golden lion snarling, vowing to tear down its very stones one by one to leave no trace of the treacherous town. "The king will be avenged," he swore, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "even if the whole town must die for it." Yet Lord Darkland, holding his ultimate trump card, threatened to execute Aerys if an assault began, and for the first time in his illustrious life, Tywin Lannister found himself truly powerless, caught between vengeance and the preservation of his king, a choice that tore at the very fabric of his being. Within those blackened, suffocating walls, Aerys Targaryen's mind, already fragile, began its inexorable twist. At first he raged, a wild beast trapped, screaming for fire and blood, for dragons and for justice. But as the days bled into weeks, his unbridled fury curdled into a cold, pervasive fear. Rats, scuttling and unseen, became his only companions, their tiny claws a constant, maddening symphony. The damp walls of his cell seemed to whisper his name, mocking him with spectral voices. He began to see phantom shadows where there were none, heard the scrape of unseen claws that were only the frantic beating of his own terror-stricken heart. He dreamed, tormented, of his ancestors, the magnificent dragon lords of old Valyria, their faces stern and ancient, and in these feverish dreams they imparted terrible secrets. "Fire is truth," they whispered, their voices like the crackling of flames. "Only through flame can the world be made pure again." When at last Sir Barristan Selmy, in an act of extraordinary courage, crept through the stinking sewers and pulled the king from that suffocating darkness, Aerys emerged a profoundly changed man. The handsome monarch who had once charmed the entire court, the radiant Aerys the Beautiful, returned to King's Landing hollow-eyed, gaunt, his once silver hair wild and uncombed, matted with filth. He spoke little, and when he did, his words burned with a venomous paranoia. "The traitors surround us," he hissed to his horrified council, his gaze darting frantically from face to face. "They are everywhere, even here in my own hall." The court initially rejoiced at his miraculous return, but their joy proved tragically short-lived. Aerys, now a shattered husk of his former self, began to perceive treachery in every shadow, every quiet glance. Lord Darkland and his entire family were burned alive by his command, their agonizing screams echoing over the city walls, a chilling prelude to what was to come. The ashes of their house, a grim, gray dust, blew across the bay, carried by the wind as a stark, horrifying warning to all who might dare to defy the dragon. Tywin said nothing, his face a mask of stone, his expression unreadable. He continued his duties with cold, implacable efficiency, restoring order, diligently repaying debts, and painstakingly maintaining a semblance of peace across the realm. But the king trusted him no longer. "He grows too powerful," Aerys muttered darkly to his sycophants. "He sits on gold enough to buy the throne itself." And so the insidious seeds of their final devastating enmity took root, destined to grow into a bitter harvest. Chris, increasingly isolated, locked himself away within the formidable walls of the Red Keep, surrounded by pale-eyed alchemists and the constant insidious murmur of whispers. He ordered wildfire to be brewed in secret, in vast quantities, for the defense of the realm, though all who witnessed his growing obsession knew its true purpose was far more sinister. He dismissed his wise, venerable counselors, men of integrity and experience, and filled their seats with fawning flatterers and simpering fools, eager to feed his growing delusions. Even Queen Rhaella was not spared his increasingly twisted suspicion. He accused her with growing ferocity of betrayal, of sorcery, of infidelity, his mind twisting every quiet moment into a sign of conspiracy. Guards, grim and unsmiling, were stationed outside her chambers, and the queen's laughter, once soft and bright, was heard no more in the halls of the keep. Prince Rhaegar, growing tall and solemn, watched his father's terrifying descent in silence, his young heart heavy with an unspoken burden. He spent his days lost in the vast libraries of the keep or beneath the ancient gnarled heart tree in the Godswood, poring over tales of legendary heroes and the cryptic prophecies of the prince who was promised. "The dragon has 3 heads," he murmured often, a cryptic refrain, though few understood the profound, tragic meaning he sought. At court, the courtiers, their voices hushed, whispered behind their hands, some clinging to a fading hope still called Aerys the Resurrected, the man who had returned from a profound darkness. But most called him something else, a name whispered only when no ears could possibly hear: the Mad King. Then came a day that would forever stand as Tywin Lannister's greatest insult, a cutting blow delivered with icy precision. The Hand, faithful through all, still sought to strengthen his bond to the throne, to repair the fractured relationship by offering his cherished daughter Cersei as a bride to Prince Rhaegar. But when the offer reached the king's ears, Aerys burst into harsh, cold laughter, a sound that echoed chillingly through the grand hall, stripping away any pretense of courtesy. "Rhaegar," he declared, his voice dripping with contempt, "shall not marry the daughter of my servant." The words, blunt and brutal, struck Tywin like a dagger to the heart of his pride. Tywin rose, bowed stiffly, his face a mask of granite, and returned to Casterly Rock, his patience finally exhausted. From that hour, the king and his Hand were enemies in all but name, their feud an open wound upon the realm. Years bled into each other, each darker, more suffocating than the last. The clandestine fires in the city's secret vaults grew, their volatile green glow casting eerie shadows. The people whispered of strange, flickering lights beneath the Red Keep at night, an unsettling sign of the madness within. And Aerys, trapped within the suffocating labyrinth of his own fears, saw enemies multiplying like grotesque shadows in the firelight. When reports arrived of growing unrest in the Stormlands and insidious whispers of rebellion stirring in the cold north, Aerys saw not dissent but the irrefutable proof he had long awaited. "They rise against me," he hissed, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "They will burn." He turned with absolute conviction to his pyromancers, those pale-eyed men who bowed before him as if he were a living god. "Make ready the wildfire," he commanded, his voice filled with a terrible zeal. "The flames will cleanse the realm." Thus began the final, devastating madness, though few yet understood the true horror unfolding. In the heart of the Red Keep, beneath the very throne of swords that consumed him, the king's alchemist toiled ceaselessly night and day, brewing a green death for a city that still slept in blissful, tragic ignorance. And in his increasingly vivid, terrifying dreams, Aerys saw dragons, not mere memories, but living, breathing beasts, flying once more over the capital, their fire raining down upon all who dared to defy him. He woke with a chilling smile on his lips. "Soon," he whispered to the empty chamber, his voice filled with a mad triumph. "Soon they will see. The dragon still lives." But far away, a tempest was gathering strength, a storm of discontent that would soon engulf the entire continent. A song of rebellion, born of injustice and despair, was beginning to be sung, a song destined to end in a crescendo of blood and fire. And in that storm's first ominous whisper, the world itself began to turn, irrevocably, against the last Dragon King. The years that followed the sundering of the once unbreakable friendship between King Aerys and Tywin Lannister were years of slow, agonizing decay, though few dared to speak its name aloud. The court still glittered with the finest silks and the most lavish feasts, a thin veneer of normalcy, but beneath the superficial gold, dark veins of fear pulsated. Servants, moving like ghosts, whispered of blood-curdling screams echoing from the lower halls of the Red Keep, and of the king's growing, terrifying fascination with fire, a hungry, consuming obsession. Aerys no longer rode among his people, no longer offered his charming smile to the court, nor did he open the great, formidable gates of the keep to petitioners seeking royal justice. He stayed within, a prisoner of his own making, pacing the long, winding corridors like a tormented specter. The Iron Throne, forged in the ancient heat of dragon flame, had become both his seat of power and his instrument of torment. He would sit there for hours, muttering to himself, his hands twitching erratically, as if the sharp blades of the throne were whispering terrible secrets only he could hear. At his side, ever-present and utterly obsequious, stood Grand Maester Pycelle, a figure of practiced falsehood, forever bending to whatever treacherous wind blew strongest within the Red Keep. Nearer still were the pyromancers, those pale-eyed, secretive alchemists of the Guild of Alchemists who spoke in hushed, reverent tones of the divine nature of fire. They fed Aerys's burgeoning delusions, telling him that dragons were not truly gone, but that their ancient potent spirit lingered within the vibrant green flames of wildfire. And the king, desperate to believe himself chosen, destined for a glorious, fiery rebirth, listened with rapt attention. "Fire is the purest of all elements," he would declare, his voice raspy with conviction. "It consumes lies. It reveals truth. In fire there is only cleansing." The more the king burned, the colder and more desolate his queen became. Queen Rhaella, once a woman of proud bearing and regal grace, found her spirit slowly, agonizingly drained by the relentless years of terror and humiliation. She bore child after child, each one, it seemed, snatched away by the stranger before their first fragile breath, until her heart was nothing but a cold, empty vessel of ash. Only Rhaegar survived, slender and solemn, a lonely prince whose eyes seemed perpetually fixed on distant, gathering storms, an unspoken future. When Rhaegar finally came of age, a flicker of hope, bright and fragile, reignited in the hearts of the court. The young prince was handsome and noble, a true Targaryen of the old, untainted blood. He spoke softly, played the harp with ethereal skill, and treated highborn and lowborn alike with a natural, unforced grace that captivated all. The people, desperate for a savior, began to whisper that perhaps he, not Aerys, was the promised dragon, the true king to come. But such words, once carried to the king's increasingly twisted ear, were like oil upon an already raging fire. "They would crown my son in my place," Aerys hissed, his eyes wild with paranoia. "My own blood conspires against me." He forbade Rhaegar to leave the city for a time, setting spies upon him, his trust in even his own heir irrevocably shattered. Yet Rhaegar endured, neither openly rebelling nor bending to his father's tyranny. In the still, quiet hours of night, he walked the hallowed godswood, reading ancient prophecies beneath the pale, rustling leaves of the heart tree. The servants whispered that he sought the meaning of a single profound riddle, the Song of Ice and Fire. It was around this ominous time that Aerys began to perceive plots everywhere, in every shadow, every fleeting glance. Lords, the hidden fires beneath the castle grew. Barrels of volatile wildfire moved through the city's labyrinthine streets under the shroud of darkness, their green glow casting eerie dancing patterns on ancient stones. "Should they come for me," Aerys told his pyromancers, his voice a low, chilling whisper, "we shall see whose flames burn hotter." Then came a feast unlike any before it, the great tournament at Harrenhal. Rhaegar himself had called for it, a desperate, valiant attempt to unite the fractured realm and heal its deep, festering wounds. Lords of every house, from the Dornish marches to the icy north, came, save for Tywin Lannister, who remained immured within the formidable stone of Casterly Rock. The common people flocked by the thousands, filling the fields surrounding the ancient castle with a vibrant tapestry of tents in every conceivable color. For a brief, fleeting moment, the Seven Kingdoms seemed to breathe again, a fragile hope blossoming. But even in the midst of this grand festival, the long, ominous shadow of the Mad King stretched, suffocating. When Aerys arrived, uninvited yet undeniably unavoidable, the boisterous crowd fell into an immediate stunned silence. Gone was the golden monarch of youth, the radiant Aerys the Beautiful. Before them rode a thin, wild-eyed figure, his once silver hair a matted, untrimmed mane, his nails like grotesque, untended claws. The very air around him seemed to shrink away, recoiling from his diseased presence. He sat upon the royal dais in armor black as night, his hands trembling with an uncontrollable tremor. When lords approached to offer their homage, he searched their faces with a frantic, paranoid intensity, as if reading betrayal in every smile, every polite gesture. Traitors, he whispered to himself, though none dared to answer or even acknowledge his madness. And there, before all the realm, Rhaegar Targaryen, the crown prince of Dragonstone, triumphed, winning the tourney list with grace and skill. His final charge against Sir Barristan Selmy broke the legendary knight's lance in two. As the trumpets sounded and the people cried his name, a wave of adulation washing over the field, Rhaegar, his gaze distant and filled with an unspoken yearning, rode past his father's dark, venomous eyes. He rode not to his lawful wife, Princess Alia Martell of Dorne, but to where Lyanna Stark, the wild and beautiful she-wolf of the north, stood among her kin. With a gesture as light and fleeting as a breath, he laid a garland of blue winter roses in her lap. Was a gesture small in itself, yet it changed absolutely everything. Whispers spread through the crowd faster than wildfire, consuming all in their path. The prince had passed over his lawful wife for the northern girl. He crowned her queen of love and beauty, the lords murmured, their voices incredulous, before the eyes of gods and men. Aerys, watching the scene unfold, saw only profound insult and blatant rebellion, his paranoia consuming him. "My son plots to steal my throne," he snarled that night, his voice thick with rage. "He would make bastards of my line." The seeds of the Great War, the devastating conflict that would consume his house, were sown in that very moment, though few yet understood the full, terrible implications. Not long after, word came that Rhaegar and Lyanna had vanished without a trace. Some whispered he had taken her by force, a monstrous act. Others murmured more quietly that she had gone willingly, swept away by a forbidden passion. The truth in the end mattered little. Her fiery brother, Brandon Stark, the Wild Wolf, rode to King's Landing in a consuming fury, demanding the prince's head on a spike. Aerys received him in the cold, echoing throne room. "Bring me Rhaegar!" Brandon shouted, his voice echoing off the formidable steel walls, a sound of raw defiance. "Or we will come for him and for you." The court, a silent, terrified mass, held its breath. Aerys smiled then, a terrible smile, thin and gleaming with a malevolent glee. "You shall have your answer," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "Bring me his father." And so Rickard Stark, the stern lord of Winterfell, traveled south to answer the summons, unaware that it was not a parley Aerys had planned, but a macabre spectacle of death. He had traps laid, torches ready to ignite the horror. The court gathered to witness, though many wished they had not, their faces pale with dread. Rickard Stark was bound in his heavy armor, suspended above a roaring fire, slowly roasting. His son Brandon was strangled slowly before his own father's agonizing eyes, a noose tightening around his throat as he thrashed desperately, fighting to reach his dying father, utterly helpless. Aerys watched, his laughter echoing through the grand hall, a chilling, inhuman sound, while the acrid smell of burning steel and flesh filled the air. When the horrific deed was done, the king rose, his face alight with a terrifying glee, and turned to his guards. "Send word to every lord," he commanded, his voice filled with a mad authority. "Send me their sons and their daughters as hostages, that I may know who is loyal, and summon my pyromancers. We must prepare. The realm is full of traitors." That day, the last fragile shreds of loyalty to the Targaryen crown burned away. The North, united in grief and righteous fury, called its banners. Robert Baratheon, fostered at the Eyrie, a mountain of a man, raised his mighty warhammer and swore a terrible oath of vengeance. Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie, defied the king's mad demand for Ned Stark's head, his foster sons. The rebellion born of blood and fire had truly begun. In the Red Keep, Aerys stood by a tall, arched window watching the city sprawl below, a vast, unsuspecting tinderbox. "Let them come," he murmured, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "Let them come and burn." He looked upon the skyline, upon the countless steps and houses, and saw not his people but mere kindling waiting for the spark. The wildfire hidden beneath the city's unsuspecting streets waited, patient and inevitable as fate. And the Mad King dreamed of dragons and of a city cleansed in all-consuming flame. The ominous drums of war rolled across the length and breadth of the Seven Kingdoms, their thunderous rhythm echoing with the promise of bloodshed. Word of the horrific Stark deaths flew north and south on the wings of countless ravens, and with each passing day, more banners emblazoned with the proud sigils of defiant houses rose in open challenge to the Iron Throne. From the windswept stormlands came Robert Baratheon, a figure of immense power and fierce resolve, his mighty warhammer gripped firmly in his hand. From the towering eyrie rode Jon Arryn and the grim, determined young Eddard Stark, their hearts bound together by shared grief and an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. The River Lords, led by the formidable Hoster Tully, joined them soon after, their daughters' fates soon to be irrevocably tied to the rebellion's tempestuous course. The realm, which had known a fragile peace in the early golden years of Aerys's reign, now seethed with the violent energies of fire and blood, a land tearing itself apart. Yet within the suffocating confines of the Red Keep, the king's madness deepened, feeding upon itself like the very wildfire he so adored, consuming him entirely. He would pace his grand hall in the long dark hours of night, muttering incoherently of dragons and betrayal, of sons who turned against their fathers, and friends who plotted in silent, treacherous whispers. The city below, once vibrant, grew fearful, a palpable dread settling over its streets. The people whispered in hushed, terrified tones of strange emerald lights flickering ominously beneath the ancient keep, of blood-curdling screams echoing in the black hours just before dawn. Sir Jaime Lannister, golden-haired and still young, had been named to the prestigious King's Guard not long before, an honor forced upon Tywin's eldest son by Aerys himself, meant as both a cruel mockery and a strategic punishment, bound Jaime irrevocably to the king's service, thus forbidding his powerful father from openly joining the burgeoning rebellion. Yet even within the pristine white armor of the Kingsguard, Jaime could discern the rot, the insidious corruption that festered beneath the crown. He had once admired Aerys, as all had in their youth, seeing the handsome, charismatic king. But now the man before him was a ruin of flesh and fear, a horrifying shell of his former self. One night the king, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity, summoned Jaime to the throne room. Aerys sat upon the Iron Throne, its sharp blades biting into his flesh, his fingers bleeding where they had inadvertently cut him. His eyes were wild, darting frantically in the dimly lit hall. "You are your father's son," he rasped, his voice raw and filled with venom. "You smile as he smiles, and you think I do not see it, but I do. All lions are the same." Jaime knelt, his face impassive, saying nothing, his heart a cold knot in his chest. "Tell me, sir," Aerys whispered, leaning forward, his breath foul. "Do you know what happens to lions when the fire grows too hot? Their fur catches, their flesh melts, and all that remains is ash." He laughed then, a sound like fingernails scraping against stone, utterly devoid of mirth. "Perhaps your father will learn that soon enough." When Tywin Lannister received word of the brutal murders of Rickard and Brandon Stark, he closed the formidable gates of Casterly Rock and waited. No raven of defiance flew from the Golden Kingdom, but none of loyalty either. "Let the stag and wolf tear each other to pieces," he said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "When the time comes, the lion will feast." And so the rebellion raged without him, a bloody maelstrom swirling across the realm while the formidable power of the Westerlands remained, for a time, ominously still. At the river crossing known as the Trident, Robert Baratheon struck victory after victory, his massive warhammer red with the blood of loyalist soldiers. The Crown's armies faltered, their morale crumbling, though Prince Rhaegar, absent for long, unexplained months, had at last returned. He rode before his men in shining armor, rubies glinting upon his breastplate, his face calm and serene as the dawn. To those who saw him, he seemed a king already, a regal figure, the last desperate hope of the dragon's proud line. But the mad king, consumed by his paranoia, saw treason even in that fragile hope. "He means to take my throne," Aerys whispered darkly to his terrified council. "He has the people's love and the Lord's loyalty. I see it in their eyes. They think him savior. They think me mad." The pyromancers bowing low before him, their pale eyes glinting, hastened to reassure him. "Let them think what they will, your grace. Fire does not ask permission to burn." And so he gave them leave to craft yet more wildfire, their dark art fueled by his madness. In secret labyrinthine chambers beneath the unsuspecting city, they worked without rest, filling the catacombs and tunnels with their potent emerald death. Hundreds of jars became thousands, hidden beneath the great sept of Baelor, beneath the guild halls, beneath the very homes of innocent citizens, a devastating unspoken threat. "If they come for me," Aerys told his men, his voice filled with a terrible, chilling resolve, "we shall leave them nothing to claim." Then came the fateful summons from the front lines. Rhaegar wished for his father to send new orders to direct the faltering war effort. Aerys sent only one, a command that sealed the doom of his house. "Kill them all," he commanded, his eyes burning with a cold, destructive fire. "Every rebel, every friend of traitors, let their kin taste the dragon's wrath." But the tide of war, once turned, could not be stemmed by madness. At the Fort of the Trident, the armies met at last, a clash of titans, Robert's banners of the crowned stag against Rhaegar's three-headed dragon. The river ran red that day, its waters stained with the blood of thousands. Songs would later call it a duel of destiny, the relentless hammer against the gleaming rubies. When it ended, the prince's breastplate lay shattered, and his precious rubies, scattered like droplets of blood, flowed downstream with the current. The rebellion had won. News of Rhaegar's death struck Aerys like a blade to the heart, plunging him into a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He wept, then he raved, then he laughed, a horrifying, hollow sound, as though the world itself were but a cruel, cosmic jest played out for his twisted amusement. He had betrayed him. Aerys shrieked, his voice raw and ragged, echoing through the sparsely peopled throne room. The few remaining courtiers flinched, their eyes darting between the deranged king and the distant, unseen chaos engulfing the city. "He sought to take what was mine," Aerys raved, spittle flying from his lips. "And now the gods have punished him. The line is pure again. The dragon remains one." His pronouncements were a desperate delusion. The truth was starkly different. The dragon was not merely broken, it was shattered, and the lords of Westeros knew it. The mighty Tyrells and the swift Red Winds, once pillars of Targaryen strength, had already bent the knee to Robert Baratheon, their loyalty shifting with the winds of war. In the scorching south, the Martells of Dorne cursed the very stones of the Iron Throne for the brutal deaths of Princess Elia and her innocent children, their grief a burning ember of hatred that would not soon extinguish. Only King's Landing, its gates sealed and its ruler a prisoner of his own escalating madness, remained ostensibly loyal. The news, carried on the swift wings of ravens, finally reached Casterly Rock. Robert Baratheon had taken the field, his hammer poised to strike. Lord Tywin Lannister, ever the calculating lion, stirred from his enforced neutrality. He gathered his formidable banners, not for open war, but for a meticulously orchestrated pretense. "We ride to save the city, my men," he proclaimed to his loyal knights, his voice cool and unwavering, a mask of duty over an abyss of ambition. "To serve our king in his hour of desperate need." Word of Tywin's approach sent a surge of frantic, trembling joy through the Red Keep. Aerys, his mind a whirlwind of paranoia and fleeting hope, clutched at this last straw. "He comes at last," he cackled, a horrifying sound devoid of true mirth. "My true hand, my oldest friend, he will bring me their heads." Jaime Lannister, standing sentinel at the foot of the throne, his white cloak a stark contrast to the deepening shadows, remained silent. His golden armor, usually a symbol of pride, now felt heavy, a growing weight of dread in his stomach. He watched his king, a man who had once been magnificent, now reduced to a gibbering wreck, and felt a cold despair settle in his heart. Then, the bells. They rang out across the city, a joyous, hopeful peal that was almost immediately drowned by the thunderous roar of the gates of King's Landing being thrown wide. The Lannister army, a golden tide, poured into the city, their armor gleaming like 1,000 coins in the afternoon sun. But the celebratory bells quickly turned into screams. No sooner had the last of the Lion's host passed the walls than the killing began. The golden lion banner, symbol of House Lannister, rose menacingly above the towers, eclipsing the three-headed dragon, and the streets below ran red, not with the blood of Robert's rebels, but with that of the very citizens Tywin had pledged to save. When the horrific word finally reached the Red Keep, Aerys's laughter died, a choked gasp of understanding that tore through his fractured mind. "He has betrayed me," he whispered, his eyes wide with a familiar, terrifying clarity. "As all have, as all will." He turned frantically to his pyromancer, a gaunt, skeletal man whose hands trembled uncontrollably as he clutched the king's final, most terrible command. "Burn them!" Aerys shrieked, his voice climbing to a fever pitch. "Burn them all! Let the city be my tomb! If I cannot rule them, let no man have them." The pyromancer, his face ashen, turned to flee and obey. But one man, an oath-bound knight in white, stood between the king's madness and the complete ruin of the city. Lannister, the youngest of the Kingsguard, the golden lion in his pristine white cloak, climbed the steps towards the Iron Throne, each clang of his boots a desperate prayer. "Your Grace," he said, his voice a tremor against the rising tide of chaos outside, "the city is lost. We must surrender. Open the gates and spare your people." Aerys spun on him, his face a mask of incandescent rage, truly monstrous in its distortion. "Spare them?" he hissed, spittle flying. "They would have seen me dragged through the streets. No, let them burn. Let them all burn." And as the Mad King, consumed by his ultimate vision of fiery annihilation, turned once more towards his pyromancer Jaime's sword Oathkeeper, by future legacy, but then simply Lion's Tooth, came free of its scabbard with a chilling whisper of steel. The blade sang, a high, keen note of protest in the torchlight, and the Mad King never finished his last, desperate command. When the doors of the throne room burst open moments later, flung wide by the invading Lannister guards, the chamber was silent save for the ominous crackle of distant flames. The king, Aerys Targaryen, lay crumpled at the foot of the Iron Throne, his regal robes stained crimson, his blood seeping into the jagged, cruel steps. Jaime stood above him, sword still in hand, his once pristine white cloak now splattered with the fresh, dark stain of regicide. Outside, the smoke of burning houses, set alight by the Lannister vanguard, rose into the darkening sky, but the green, hungry glow of wildfire remained unlit beneath the city. King's Landing was spared its fiery immolation. The last dragon, or at least the last king to claim that title, was dead, and with that single bloody stroke, the 3-century reign of the Targaryens ended not in glory, but in a final, terrifying paroxysm of madness and ash. The smoke that billowed above King's Landing that day was more than just burning wood and flesh. It was the funeral pyre of an age, the fall of the dragons, and the birth of a new, harsher, and far more cynical realm. When the city gates were finally thrown wide, the grim reality was laid bare. Bodies of the slain littered the blood-slicked streets, twisted like broken dolls, and above the towers of the Red Keep, the crimson and gold banners of House Lannister hung like hungry vultures. The stench of death, heavy and cloying, mingled with the sharp, acidic tang of wildfire that had slumbered beneath the city, never fully ignited. A silent green promise of destruction, barely averted. Aerys Targaryen, last of his name to sit upon the Iron Throne, lay cold and still in his own blood, and with his last echoing heartbeat, the ancient glorious songs of his lineage fell silent. Sir Jaime Lannister stood alone beside the corpse, his sword still warm with the heat of his deed, clutched in a numb hand. For a long, silent time, he did not move. The Iron Throne, a monstrous amalgam of blades, loomed over him, its jagged edges gleaming with the reflected firelight from the torch sconces. He thought of all the men who had cut themselves upon its cruel edges, of his king's bleeding hands, of the madness that had dripped like poison from Aerys's tongue. He had slain the very man he was sworn, by the most sacred of vows, to protect. And in that moment, gazing at the twisted metal, he understood with a crushing certainty that no oath, no justification, no necessity could ever truly cleanse such a deed. The city was safe, yes, but his honor, his pristine knightly reputation, lay buried deep within the ashes of the dragon he had killed. Lord Tywin Lannister entered the throne room then, his golden armor spattered with soot, his face impassive as he surveyed the scene. He looked first upon the body of the king, then upon his son, whose white cloak was a canvas of crimson horror. "So ends the madness," he said quietly, his voice devoid of his customary pride. A rare moment of understated gravity from the formidable lord. He gazed upon the Iron Throne, and in its gleaming, distorted reflection, he saw his future, the immense power he had so long been denied, a power now almost within his grasp. But Tywin was no fool. He knew the realm, weary and suspicious, would never accept a lion directly upon that seat, not while the thunderous hammer of Robert Baratheon still echoed on the fields beyond, still demanding allegiance. The doors opened again, more cautiously this time, and through them strode Eddard Stark, grim-faced and bone-weary from the brutal war. He had come with Robert's army, riding hard to find the city already taken, the battle ostensibly won, but the true cost was starkly visible. He looked upon the dead king, then upon Jaime, whose sword still dripped crimson onto the marble floor. "What have you done?" Eddard asked, his voice low, heavy with a profound disbelief that was almost a lament. "What had to be done?" Jaime answered, his eyes hollow, empty as burnt-out coals. "He would have burned us all." Eddard's face hardened, his northern honor rigid and unyielding. "You swore an oath." "I kept the realm safe," Jaime retorted, a flicker of desperate justification in his gaze. "Does that count for nothing?" But there was no forgiveness in the stern gray eyes of the wolf, and so the legend was born. Word spread quickly after that, like a virulent plague, of the Kingslayer who had murdered his sworn lord, of the false saviors who had entered the city under a banner of peace and brought only death and betrayal. Heroic songs that might have praised Jaime's desperate act of mercy were never sung. Instead, only whispers of treachery followed him. Elsewhere, far from the blood-soaked capital, another tragedy, equally profound and perhaps even more significant, unfolded. The highest, most ancient chamber of Dragonstone's Sea Dragon Tower, Queen Rhaella Targaryen, labored to bring forth her last child. She had fled the burgeoning madness of her king Aerys weeks before, her heart a heavy stone of dread, seeking refuge on the ancestral island. Outside, the skies were a bruised black, and a furious storm, a tempest of unprecedented ferocity, raged around the castle, thunder rolling like the vengeful voices of angry gods. The maesters and midwives, pale with fear, whispered prayers to the seven, but Rhaella, her body racked with pain and exhaustion, spoke none. She had lost too many babes already, stillborns, miscarriages, fragile infants who never drew a full breath, her heart a graveyard of tiny hopes. When the storm finally broke, with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient castle, lightning split the sky in a blinding flash, and a child came screaming into the world, a girl, tiny and vulnerable, with hair of spun silver and eyes the impossible shade of pale violet. "Daenerys," the queen whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring wind as she held her daughter close. "Stormborn of the blood of the dragon." That very night, Rhaella Targaryen died, her strength utterly spent, her life force extinguished by the agony of childbirth and the sorrow of a dying house. Only the infant Daenerys, her young brother Viserys, and a handful of fiercely loyal men survived the storm and the fall of their house. Among them was Sir Willem Darry, a grizzled old knight who, with grim determination, took the two royal children across the narrow sea, away from the ashes of their former glory, away from the usurper's wrath. The Targaryen line still lived, a flicker of defiance, but it was broken, scattered like embers in the unrelenting wind, its future uncertain. Back in King's Landing, a new age had truly begun as Robert Baratheon, the Stag King, took the Iron Throne. He was a warrior forged for battle, broad of shoulder and barrel-chested, with a booming laugh like thunder and a temper that could match it. The realm, weary of madness, hailed him as a savior, and lords from every corner bent the knee to his newly forged crown. Yet for all his triumphant victories, for all the celebration, there was no true joy in his eyes. When he looked upon the Iron Throne, he saw not triumph, but ghosts, the lingering shadows of a love lost. He asked after Lyanna, the spirited wolf maid whose abduction had ignited his rebellion, the woman for whom he had fought and bled. None could give him comfort. She had been found dying in a bed of blood and roses within the Tower of Joy, her last words a secret whispered only to Eddard Stark, never to be spoken again. The new king, for all his bluster and bravado, wept for her in secret, deep within the Red Keep, and the sound of his grief was like the breaking of a storm, raw and desolate. The realm, scarred and exhausted, tentatively tried to heal. The Lannisters, for their timely betrayal, were handsomely rewarded, their vast debts repaid with prestigious titles and mountains of gold. The Starks, grim and silently stoic, returned to their cold northern fastness, their honor intact, but their hearts heavy with the compromises of war. The Baratheons ruled from the Iron Throne, but the shadow of the Mad King, a spectral presence, lingered over them all. The burned halls of the Red Keep were cleaned, the countless bodies buried, but the acrid smell of smoke, a phantom scent of destruction, never fully left its ancient stones. Jaime, the Kingslayer, remained in the Kingsguard, his white cloak a constant mocking reminder of his broken vows. He was bound now not by the honor he had so famously sacrificed, but by the crushing weight of what he had done, by the indelible stain on his name. Men called him regicide, whispered of his treachery behind cupped hands, and openly turned their faces away when he passed. He bore it with a cold, almost defiant stoicism, yet every night when he closed his eyes, he saw the same horrifying tableau, the flash of steel, the spatter of blood, the wide, mad eyes of Aerys, and the monstrous fire that had never come, the greater ruin he had averted at such a terrible personal cost. And so it was that the age of dragons truly ended, and the age of men, imperfect and often brutal, began anew. Yet even as a fragile peace returned, the cracks in the realm's heart began to widen, subtle at first, but deep. The last Targaryens, adrift across the narrow sea, nursed dreams of vengeance and restoration. The new king, Robert, drank deeply and often, seeking to forget the love he had lost and the crown he wore so uneasily. The lion, Tywin, smiled, patient and calculating as ever, his ambitions merely postponed, not abandoned. And in the quiet, torchlit gloom of the throne room, the Iron Throne stood waiting, its jagged edges gleaming like polished fangs in the dark. It was said that when the wind rose through the drafty hall, it whispered faintly of the past, of a king's laughter turned to madness, of a sun-crowned prince adorned in rubies, of a city that had almost burned to ash. And those who listened closely, those with a particular sensitivity to history's echoes, swore they could still hear Aerys's voice, distant and terrible, echoing from the very stones, a single chilling command: burn them all. The pyromancers, architects of the green flame, were scattered but not destroyed. Some vanished into hiding, taking their arcane secrets with them. Deep below the city, sealed behind forgotten walls and through ancient winding tunnels, the last jars of wildfire still slept, silent and green, waiting. For fire, true fire, does not die easily. It only waits for breath, for spark, to wake it once more. And though the Mad King was gone, the destructive flames he had kindled would one day burn again, through prophecy, through blood, through the potent, restless dreams of dragons yet unborn. Thus ended the tragic tale of Aerys II Targaryen, last of his line to rule from the Iron Throne. The poets, in their cautious verse, would call him the Mad King, painting him as a monster beyond reason. But in the dusty, half-forgotten ashes of history, some whispered a different truth, that he had only seen too far, too clearly, that he had glimpsed the fire at the heart of the world itself and had, in his desperate attempt to control it, been utterly consumed by it. Yet madness, whether born of fear or of a terrifying, prescient vision, left only ruin in its wake. And the realm, scarred and trembling, could do nothing but carry on, its hard-won peace as fragile as glass, its future already turning precariously in the relentless winds of fate. The throne of swords sat in silence, but the ghosts of those who had died for it, or upon it, lingered still, restless and demanding. Years passed. Yet the memory of the Mad King clung to the walls of the Red Keep like the pervasive scent of smoke that no amount of washing or scrubbing could ever truly drive away. The reign of Robert Baratheon was meant to be a glorious new beginning, a golden era of peace, strength, and robust laughter. But even peace, when born of such violence, can carry the bitter taste of ashes. The early days of his rule, King Robert walked the echoing halls of the Red Keep as if to test their foundations, like a man trying on a crown that did not yet truly fit, a garment too stiff for his warrior's frame. He was not born to silk and ceremony, nor bred for courtly intrigue. He was a creature of the battlefield, loud and overflowing with life, far more comfortable beneath an open, storm-swept sky than beneath the crushing weight of a ceiling built for mythical dragons. He drank deep, fought harder, and filled the court with a boisterous noise designed to drown out the insidious whispers that haunted it. Whispers of the past, of duty unfulfilled, of ghosts. The people cheered him, for he was everything Aerys was not, bold, outwardly fair, and blessedly mortal. Yet behind his booming laughter lay a profound sorrow he could never quite put to rest, a wound that festered despite the passing years. Every night, in the solitary darkness of his royal chambers, he dreamed of a girl with the haunting scent of winter roses in her hair, and every morning he awoke beside a queen he did not love, a woman he saw as a political necessity rather than a cherished wife. Cersei Lannister had come to him in the raw, messy aftermath of the war, a living trophy of the fragile peace. Her beauty was bright as newly forged gold, blinding and formidable, but her smile, always perfectly composed, hid the quiet, simmering fury of her powerful house and of her own unyielding will. To the realm, she was the beautiful symbol of peace, the strategic union of the stag and the lion. But to Robert, she was a constant, unwelcome reminder of all he had lost, of the life that had been snatched away. He had wanted Lyanna Stark, the wild, proud wolf maid who had died in blood and silence, her secrets taken to the grave. No crown, however jeweled, no queen, however fair, could ever fill the vast, aching emptiness her absence had left behind. The court under the new king underwent a profound transformation. The ancient, revered songs of dragons were forbidden, their melodies silenced. Targaryen banners, once proudly displayed, were torn down, burned, or hastily replaced. Even the formidable stone dragon heads that had adorned the Red Keep's walls for centuries were systematically broken off, their ancient, sightless eyes gouged out so that they might never, ever watch again. Only the Iron Throne itself remained untouched, a testament to and the Conqueror's formidable will, for even Robert, with all his strength, dared not alter what such a legendary figure had forged. He sat upon it uneasily, constantly shifting as if the jagged blades might still cut him, just as they had, quite literally, cut Aerys before him. And far away, across the vast rolling expanse of the narrow sea, the last embers of the dragon's blood, tenuous and flickering, lived on. The bustling, vibrant, free cities, the exiled Prince Viserys Targaryen wandered from court to decadent court, a proud beggar dressed in fading silks, his lineage his only currency. The years of desperate flight, of humiliation and dependence, had twisted him, corroding his spirit. As a frightened boy, he had matured into a man consumed by bitterness and a feverish, volatile pride. He endlessly proclaimed himself the true dragon, heir to an empire, but behind his back, men merely laughed, seeing only a desperate, deluded fool. He carried his father's madness in his eyes, a chilling glacial burn that was colder, sharper, and more brittle than the edge of glass. His sister, Daenerys, the girl born in the heart of the storm, grew up beneath the oppressive shadow of his volatile presence. She knew little of Westeros beyond the embellished, often terrifying stories Viserys relentlessly told her. Tales of golden palaces stolen by treacherous usurpers, of deceitful lords, of a throne that was hers by divine right. He made her repeat those words, drilling them into her young mind until she could recite them without a moment's thought. "We are the blood of the dragon." But Daenerys, in her quiet, watchful way, did not truly remember the Iron Throne, nor the Red Keep, nor the Mad King her brother so adamantly called father. Her earliest, most visceral memories were of the salty air of countless ports, of cold, comfortless nights, and above all of pervasive, gnawing fear, the constant terror that they would be discovered by the assassins Robert Baratheon relentlessly sent across the sea to extinguish the last Targaryen embers. The dark, hushed hours, Viserys would whisper of vengeance, his hands trembling with a fervent intensity as he spoke of fire reborn, of dragons returning. He promised her dragons, golden crowns, and the burning annihilation of their enemies. Yet Daenerys, ever quiet and observant, could see the heartbreaking truth in his feverish eyes. The dragon her brother claimed to be was only a man, a pathetic shadow. Back in Westeros, Robert's realm began to settle into an uneasy, often restless calm. The major wars were done, the banners furled, but this forced peace did not breed widespread joy. The king himself grew increasingly restless, his booming laughter too often turning to bursts of ill-tempered anger when courtiers dared to whisper of mounting debts and royal duties. The wine flowed freely through the Red Keep's halls, and his belly thickened with years of lavish feasting and neglect. Tywin Lannister, ever the master manipulator, returned to Casterly Rock, where he ruled his domains in quiet, unassailable power, his daughter's golden-haired children growing steadily in the royal nursery, securing the Lannister legacy within the very heart of the royal family. The Queen's twin brother, Jaime, remained with the Kingsguard, his white cloak impeccably clean, a stark contrast to the name that was forever stained. The bards with their cruel songs called him Oathbreaker, Kingslayer, Liar, and worse. And yet for all the venomous whispers, none dared face him with sword in hand, for his skill and ferocity were legendary. In the Stark North, Eddard Stark ruled Winterfell with the stern, unyielding honor of his ancient house. His memories of that bloody day in the throne room, of the dead king and the boy in the white armor, of the sickening stench of blood and betrayal, never faded, etching themselves onto his very soul. When he had knelt before Robert to place the crown upon his brow, a part of him had already turned away from the capital, forever tainted. The South to him was a place of deceit, moral decay, and ultimate ruin. The North, cold and distant, was his true refuge, his sanctuary of unblemished honor. But even in the remote fastness of Winterfell, the whispers eventually reached him. They spoke of the last Targaryens, still living, still breathing, across the narrow sea. Some wished them dead, a final solution to an old problem. Others feared what might come if they were not, a return of the dragons that had once ruled with fire and blood. In the quiet, candlelit halls of the Red Keep, Grand Maester Pycelle, ancient and seemingly benign, counseled endless patience, while Lord Varys, the enigmatic master of whisperers, spun his intricate webs of information and intrigue in the deepest shadows. "The realm is safe," he would murmur, his eunuch's voice soft and disarming, "so long as the dragons do not rise again." But his eyes, black and unblinking, always seemed to look eastward, beyond the sunrise, towards the distant, mysterious lands where dragons had once flown, and where perhaps they still waited. Years passed, merging into a decade, and the name of Aerys Targaryen slowly faded from the everyday lips of the common people, becoming little more than a distant cautionary tale. Yet his madness had not vanished entirely. It had merely shifted shape, seeping into the collective memory, into the deep-seated fears of the populace, and subtly, insidiously, into the very hearts of those who ruled in his stead. For the Iron Throne, forged of conquered swords, had a way of changing those who sat upon it, of demanding a terrible price. It cut deep, drawing blood, and every drop it drew was a faint, chilling whisper to the next king, promising ultimate power, but always, always warning of the fire that lay beneath. Sometimes, when the moon hung high and full over King's Landing, and the torches burned low within the Red Keep, the servants swore they could still hear strange sounds echoing from deep beneath the castle, a faint serpentine hiss, a bubbling, viscous sound, like something ancient and alive, patiently waiting. They said the king's wildfire had never been fully found, that the pyromancer's caches, vast and volatile, still slept beneath the sprawling city, a green, glowing promise of doom. Some claimed the old alchemists, their faces shrouded, still met in secret, praying over the dormant green flames, desperate to reawaken the terrible power they had once served. Robert Baratheon, ever dismissive of such morbid tales, merely laughed when he heard them. "Let the past rot," he would roar, raising his goblet high, where "the dragons are dead. Let them stay that way." But in the smoky taverns and on lonely, windswept roads, songs began to rise again, quietly at first, sung by those who remembered the old blood, whispered melodies of the dragon's inevitable return. And across the narrow sea, in the warm, humid air of a rented house in Pentos, a slender girl with silver hair stood upon a moonlit balcony, staring out over the dark, restless waters towards a land she had never seen, a kingdom that existed only in her brother's feverish dreams. The wind, stirring from the east, tugged gently at her silver hair like a faint, beckoning whisper from another world. She did not yet know the true name of the father who had gone mad, nor the horrifying depth of the ruin he had brought upon his house and his people. She knew only that the stories her brother told her called him Dragon, and that dragons in the legends were not meant to die forever. She closed her eyes and thought she could almost hear something in the immense distance, faint and low, yet powerful and resonant, like the slow, steady beat of vast, leathery wings. The years slid by like the slow, inexorable turning of a colossal wheel, grinding down kings and crowns alike, wearing away at even the strongest foundations. The echoing halls of the Red Keep, the triumphant banners of House Baratheon now fluttered proudly, where once the majestic three-headed dragon had flown. Yet the very stones of the ancient castle, deep within their cold memory, seemed to remember a different time. When the wind swept down from the bay, carrying the distant cry of gulls, it often carried a whisper that tasted of smoke and profound sorrow, as though the very walls grieved for what had been lost or perhaps for what might yet return. King Robert, once lean and powerful, grew heavier with each passing year, his once joyous laughter now often booming through the feasting halls, only to be quickly followed by a rage just as loud and terrifying when wine or some painful, unbidden memory soured his mood. He hunted and drank with a reckless abandon, as though the fire of war still burned fiercely in his blood, demanding an outlet. But the crown, a heavy circle of gold, sat ever more uneasily upon his brow. He ruled as a warrior rules, with bursts of strength and impulsive command, not with the patient wisdom or careful prudence required of a true monarch. The realm, beneath its veneer of stability, survived largely on the collective will and quiet manipulations of his council, each man playing his own intricate, often self-serving game beneath the ever-present shadow of the Iron Throne. Queen Cersei, golden and beautiful but cold as a winter's sun, learned quickly how to wield power even without the title of ruling monarch. Her striking beauty effortlessly turned heads, but her sharp cunning and ruthless intelligence more effectively turned hearts, or at least bent them to her will. She bore the king 3 golden-haired children, each a perfect, undeniable mirror of her twin brother Jaime, though few in the realm dared to speak that treacherous thought aloud. To the realm, they were the legitimate heirs to the Baratheon line, securing the new dynasty. Cersei, they were her quiet, perfect vengeance against a husband who loved only ghosts, and against a world that had denied her true power. Robert, for his part, did not look too closely at his children or at his wife's ambitions. He had long ceased to care for the intricate, tedious machinations of politics, finding far greater comfort and oblivion in his cups than in the sober deliberations of his council. "Let them plot," he would often bellow, waving away the worried pronouncements of his advisers with a dismissive hand. "So long as the wine flows and the realm stands, I am content." But the ECEC. Superficial capi easily as it seemed. Beneath the surface of this hard-won peace lay mountains of debt, generations of festering grudges, and the restless, unquiet memory of fire and ancient blood. Old lords still openly cursed the Targaryen name, condemning them to oblivion. Yet others, in the secrecy of their own keeps, spoke it with a strange, nostalgic longing, a quiet yearning for the return of what once was. The dragons had ruled for nearly 300 years, and their sudden, violent absence had left a hollow in the heart of Westeros, a void too deep and vast to ever truly fill. And in that hollow, subtly at first, whispers began to grow once more, like weeds pushing through cracked paving stones. Across the narrow sea, the exiled Prince Viserys, once a frightened boy, had grown into a man, though not a wise one. The years of begging, of constant wandering from city to city, had left his pride twisted and brittle, Like a prized sword left too long in the corrosive salt air, rusting and snapping under pressure, he had spent his fragile youth repeating his father's mad words, "I am the dragon, and I will have what is mine," until he could no longer discern where the desperate truth ended and his own inherited madness began. To him, Westeros was not a fading memory of childhood, but a burning, all-consuming obsession, a glittering dream forever just beyond his reach. With him traveled Daenerys, his last hope, and in his cruel calculation, his last weapon. She had grown into a slender girl of quiet grace, her eyes the pale, haunting violet of her ancient bloodline, her hair the ethereal color of moonlight reflecting on snow. She knew her brother's quick, savage temper, his insatiable hunger for what he believed was his casual cruelty, and had learned long ago how to move like water flowing around the sharp edges of his rage, bending but never breaking. When he called her my Silver Queen, a title laden with his own ambitions, she merely bowed her head and said nothing, though the words tasted like iron chains in her mouth. They lived in borrowed houses and dined on borrowed coin, always on the move from Bravos to Myr to Pentos, forever chased by mounting debt and a gnawing despair. Yet Viserys, blind to their reality, would speak to her each night of the magnificent home they would reclaim, of the banners that would gloriously rise once more beneath their ancient sigil. "You are the daughter of the dragon," he would say, his fingers tracing the silver strands of her hair with a possessive touch. "And one day we shall return to the land that was stolen from us." Daenerys listened, a silent, captive audience, though she had never seen the fabled land he spoke of. The Westeros of her brother's grandiose tales was a dream of fire and glory, of conquest and rightful rule, not the desolate, blood-soaked place her father had left in ashes. In her heart she felt no burning hunger for vengeance, only a profound, aching longing for peace, for a quiet place to truly belong, a sanctuary from the endless flight. But the ancient blood of the dragon, however dormant, is not easily stilled, and in her sleep she sometimes dreamed vividly of vast, leathery wings and consuming flame. One cool, humid night, as the moon hung heavy and luminous over the dark waters of Pentos, they were summoned to a lavish feast hosted by a powerful merchant prince named Illyrio Mopatis. His opulent hall was filled with the glitter of gold and the exotic scent of spices, his booming laughter thick with unspoken promise and veiled intent. "The wheel of fate turns, my young prince and princess," Illyrio told them, his fat fingers heavy with rings gesticulating expansively. "There are men in the East who still remember your ancient house, men who hunger for what was. And there are men in the West who have grown careless, fat, and complacent in their usurped power. The time for dragons, my dears, may come again." Viserys' eyes burned with a feverish, desperate light. "Then give me an army," he demanded, his voice cracking with intensity. "Give me ships, give me swords, give me gold. I will take back the 7 kingdoms, and the usurper will fall." Illyrio only smiled, a knowing, placid expression. "Nothing is freely given, my prince," he purred, his eyes twinkling. "But there are ways, alliances, marriages, trades that can make even the most impossible dreams into flesh." And so, with those subtle words, the seed was planted, the terrible bargain set. Soon after, Daenerys was told of her fate. She would be wed to Khal Drogo, a powerful, fearsome warlord of the Dothraki Sea, in exchange for the might of his legendary riders. Viserys spoke of it as a triumph, a cunning stroke of genius. "When I sit upon the Iron Throne," he declared, his eyes shining with avarice and delusion, "you shall sit beside me, sister. You will be my queen." Daenerys said nothing, her customary silence a shield, but in the quiet solitude of her chamber she pressed her hand against the cool stone of the window frame and stared out at the dark, indifferent sea. Somewhere beyond that vast horizon lay the land of her birth, the land of her father's terrifying madness, her mother's tragic death, and her brother's desperate, all-consuming dreams. She wondered, with a quiet, profound sadness, what kind of place it was that men would burn and kill for, that demanded such a terrible, unending price in blood and suffering. In the harsh, revealing light of the morning, she stood before Drogo for the first time. He was tall as a tower, with skin like burnished copper and hair black as midnight, braided long and entwined with bells in the proud, unyielding style of his people. He said little, his presence immense and primal, but his gaze was heavy, assessing, measuring her with an animalistic intensity. Daenerys, it was the yet for it was a, their show up to her, but this far waiting to the world, the hot here, the to Daenerys small, yet as the suffocating fear that had been her constant companion for years, the terror of her brother's capricious hand, his volatile temper, the humiliating knowledge that she was nothing more than a pawn in his grand delusional game, began slowly but surely to recede. It was a shedding of skin, a freeing of the spirit, the ceaseless wind whipping across her face, the fierce, unyielding sun baking her skin, the primal rhythmic thud of hooves beneath her. They were not merely elements, but invigorating forces. They filled her with a vibrant, raw sense of life she had never known. Drogo, her formidable husband, was a man of stark, potent silences and few words, yet his very presence was like fire, fierce, consuming in its intensity, yet remarkably steady and unwavering. He offered her no gentle courtship, no whispered endearments in the manner of Westerosi knights. Instead, there was a profound, unspoken honor in his actions, a wild, undeniable certainty that required no elaborate speech. He had called her Moon of My Life, and when those guttural, deeply resonant words left his lips, something deep within Daenerys began to believe them. Viserys, however, remained utterly blind to this transformation. He strutted through the Khalasar with the arrogant delusion of a king among beggars, his mouth perpetually overflowing with threats and grand pronouncements. He spoke endlessly of the Iron Throne, of bloody vengeance, of stolen crowns. But the Dothraki, keen observers of true power, merely laughed. To them, he was a pitiful child who lacked even the fundamental skill of riding, a spoiled prince with nothing but empty words. One day, Viserys declared to Daenerys, his eyes burning with an almost manic brightness, "They will give me my army. One day I will take back what is mine." Daenerys looked at him then, and chillingly she saw the faint, unsettling shadow of her father, the Mad King, reflected in his feverish eyes. It was the same devouring hunger, the same all-consuming madness that had destroyed everything it touched. A flicker of pity stirred within her, a new, unfamiliar sensation. But fear, that she realized with a quiet jolt, was gone. The days continued to grow hotter, the sun a relentless hammer in the sky. The Khalasar rode eastward, an unstoppable tide towards Vaes Dothrak, the holy city of their people, a sanctuary where by ancient law no blood was to be spilled and no weapon ever drawn. There, nestled beneath the colossal, silent sentinel of the Mother of Mountains, Daenerys was to be presented as a true Khaleesi. She bore the immense weight of expectation in a newfound silence, feeling something powerful and utterly new stirring within her, a strength that was neither borrowed from her brother nor granted by her husband, but born fiercely and authentically of her own heart. Night, beneath a bloated, blood-red moon hanging heavy in the sky, she dreamed again of fire. In this dream, she stood not before consuming flames, but before a great, terrifyingly beautiful black dragon, its scales gleaming like polished obsidian steel. Its eyes, ancient and knowing, held the unsettling madness of her father and the desperate sorrow of her brother, yet they also pulsed with an immense, unfathomable power and the promise of ruin. She braced herself, certain it would devour her, but instead, with a slow, deliberate movement, the magnificent beast bowed its massive head before her. When she reached out a trembling hand, the heat radiating from it did not burn. It welcomed her. She awoke with tears tracing silver paths down her cheeks. Yet a strange, profound calm settled deep within her chest. In the days that followed, Viserys' desperation festered and grew, twisting into an ugly, impatient rage. He harangued Drogo relentlessly, demanding the promised ships and soldiers. But the Khal, ever calm, merely offered a cryptic smile and the Dothraki proverb, "When the moon mounts the sun." The words, intended as a dismissal, only fueled Viserys' fury. He, in his arrogance and profound ignorance of Dothraki custom, could not comprehend that among these proud riders, vows were not given lightly, nor were they forgotten. "He mocks me," Viserys spat, his voice thick with venom. "He thinks me his servant, but I am the dragon." That night, intoxicated and trembling with fury, he burst unannounced into the great feast of the Khalasar. A sword forbidden within Vaes Dothrak glinted dangerously in his hand. His hair, usually carefully braided, was tangled and wild, and his eyes glowed with a feverish, dangerous light. "You will give me my crown!" he shrieked, his voice shrill and cracked with madness. "You will give it to me, now, or I will take it myself." Drogo rose slowly, his immense form unfolding with a terrifying grace, his expression utterly unreadable. Sudden profound silence descended upon the great tent, crushing the boisterous laughter and music. Then, in a voice as calm and hard as carved stone, the call spoke. "A crown for a king!" The Dothraki moved with swift, brutal efficiency, seizing Viserys before he could even register their intent. Daenerys, her heart pounding against her ribs, tried to cry out to intervene, but her voice caught, strangled in her throat. Her brother was forced to his knees, his wild struggles futile. Drogo, his face impassive, poured a pot of gold medallions into a cauldron, watching as the metal melted and shimmered, glowing white with incandescent heat. "Crown him," he commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. When the molten, searing gold was poured slowly, deliberately upon Viserys's head, he did not scream, he did not even make a sound. The liquid fire streamed down his face, smoking, his flesh sizzling, and when the metal finally cooled, hardening into a grotesque golden crown, he lay utterly still, his eyes wide and vacant. Daenerys, her voice barely a whisper, a truth echoing from deep within her newfound strength, finally understood. "He was no dragon," she murmured, a profound certainty in her words. "Fire cannot kill a dragon." From that day forward, she carried herself with a new, quiet authority, a silent power that resonated through the Khalasar. The fierce men of the Dothraki, once dismissive, now bowed their heads in respect when she passed. Even the revered Dosh Khaleen, the wise women of Vaes Dothrak, looked upon her with something akin to deference and perhaps a flicker of fear. Time flowed like the great rivers of the West, bringing change. Daenerys's belly began to swell with the child of Khal Drogo, and the Dothraki spoke of him with fervent reverence, calling him the stallion who mounts the world, the prophesied leader who would unite all riders beneath a single unstoppable banner. Kyo, his eyes burning with fierce pride, swore a solemn oath. He would cross the narrow sea for his son. He would conquer the seven kingdoms and present them as a glorious gift to the babe. For the first time, Daenerys found herself contemplating her brother's long-held dream, not as a madman's delusion, but as a tangible, attainable destiny. And even as the hot winds of that summer whispered promises of conquest in the east, another, more insidious fire was stirring in the ancient halls of King's Landing. Lord Varys, the Spider, his whispers soft and poisonously effective, cautioned the aging king of unseen threats, of assassins lurking in the distant east, of the dragon's blood still breathing dangerously alive. Grand Maester Pycelle, ever the sycophant, dismissed such rumors as madness, but King Robert Baratheon's famous temper was quick to flare, his face reddening with a familiar, dangerous rage. "I will not wait for the dragons to grow wings again," he snarled, slamming his fist onto a heavy table. "Kill them, both of them." The royal order, heavy with death, was dispatched across the sea, a bag of glittering gold offered for a whisperer's knife. But Illyrio's network of spies, nimble and swift, proved even quicker. Word reached the Khalasar with alarming speed, and Daenerys, her hand instinctively flying to her growing belly, trembled for her unborn child. Drogo's wrath, when he learned of the threat, was a storm beyond reckoning, a primal force of nature unleashed. "They sought to kill my son," he roared, his voice like thunder rolling across the plains before his assembled riders. "They sought to strike at my blood. I will tear down their stone houses and take their iron chair. I will give my son the world." The Dothraki, a sea of wild, roaring warriors, cheered in a deafening chorus, beating their spears against their chests. In that moment, a fundamental shift occurred. The fate of kingdoms, unseen, hinged upon that guttural cry. For the first time, the consuming fires of vengeance that had burned so erratically and madly in Viserys's heart now began to ignite in Daenerys's own. But hers was not a mad fire, not a consuming blaze of delusion. It was steady, patient, and ran impossibly deep, rooted in a fierce, protective love. As the Khalasar prepared to ride westward, their purpose now forged in fire, Daenerys stood alone beside the sacred lake of Vaes Dothrak. The pale moonlight kissed the 3 dragon eggs she had carried so carefully since her wedding day. She lifted one, the black streaked with crimson like dried blood, and held it. It pulsed faintly in her hands, a living thrum, warm and undeniably alive. "The dragons are dead," Jorah Mormont, her sworn knight, said softly from behind her, his voice imbued with a quiet, weary realism. Daenerys did not answer, her gaze fixed on the pulsating egg. She felt the faint, ancient thrum of power beneath her fingers, an echo of something primordial that had slept for far too long. She thought of her father, of his consuming madness, of the destructive fire that had devoured everything it touched. And for the very first time, she felt no fear of it. "The dragons are not dead," she whispered, her voice resonating with a new fierce conviction. "They are only sleeping." The wind rose suddenly, a hot, wild breath across the plains, and for a fleeting heartbeat, it seemed to carry the faintest, most ethereal sound of wings. Far away, beyond the vast, indifferent sea, the Iron Throne sat cold and imposing beneath its jagged crown of blades. In its deep shadow, men still dreamed their petty dreams of power, clutching at fading glory. But across the world, cradled in the hands of a silver-haired girl beneath a foreign, watchful moon, the ancient blood of the dragon began to stir once more. The long grass swayed like a rippling sea of gold beneath the burning endless sky, and the Dothraki rode at its very heart, an unstoppable river of dust and thunder. Their wild laughter and fierce war cries were carried far on the wind, but Daenerys Targaryen heard only the steady rhythm of her own breath and the strong, determined beat of her heart. The long days of fear, of uncertainty, of being a pawn, they were gone, vanished like mist. She was Khaleesi now, wife to Khal Drogo, and soon mother to the child who was destined to be king of the world. Yet peace in such a life born of fire and blood was never meant to last. The gods, it seemed, were far from finished with her. When the sun rode high and mercilessly in the heavens, the Khalasar crossed the great parched plains, pushing relentlessly towards the western lands, where merchants waited with their wares of slaves and gleaming silver. Drogo, proud and restless, sought to trade, to arm his riders with the superior steel of the West before they began their monumental war across the sea. The vast Khalasar stretched for endless miles, a human wave, and Daenerys rode among them, her belly heavy with the son she would soon bear, the prophesied stallion. In her heart, she had already named him Rhaego, a tribute to the brother she had lost and the legendary prince her father had so tragically broken. But behind her, shadows were lengthening, growing more ominous with each passing day. The royal order to kill the Targaryen exiles, whispered and carried across the narrow sea, had finally seeped into the very fabric of the free cities, passed from port to port, tavern to tavern. Few things in the world, she would soon learn, were faster than a king's fear, and fewer still were more deadly. The first assassin came disguised as a peddler in Vaes Dothrak, his smile a practiced, unsettling gesture beneath a heavy, false beard. He offered a gift, a cask of richly sweet spiced wine. But Jorah Mormont, the seasoned knight who had bound his fate to hers, possessed a keen eye and a deep understanding of men. He saw the cold, murderous lie in the peddler's eyes before a single drop of poison could pass Daenerys' lips. The assassin died swiftly, brutally beneath a volley of Dothraki spears, his body skewered, and the poisoned wine spilled across the sacred earth like a spreading stain of dark blood. When Drogo learned of the treacherous intent, his rage erupted like a volcanic storm. He rose before his riders, his magnificent braid gleaming with gold rings, his voice thunder rolling across the vast plain, a terrifying declaration. "They sought to kill my son," he roared, his fury shaking the ground. "They sent their knives across the sea to strike at my blood. I will take their iron chair and make it my throne. I will kill their men and enslave their women. I will tear down their stone houses and melt their proud cities to sand." The Dothraki screamed in answer, a primal, frenzied roar, beating their spears against their chests until the very earth itself seemed to tremble in anticipation. The war that Viserys had so desperately, so madly dreamed of would now indeed come to pass, but it would not be his war, would be hers. That night, as Drogo stood before the sacred fire, swearing his terrible vengeance to the heavens, Daenerys stood apart, a quiet, formidable figure. Her hand rested upon her swollen belly, a protective gesture. She watched the flames twist and reach towards the starry sky, their flickering shapes dancing eerily like nascent dragons. In their fierce shifting light, she imagined she saw her father's face, mad, burning with an almost triumphant fire. And to that spectral image she whispered, her voice low and resolute, "Not as you did, father, not with madness, but with strength." But the gods, as she was soon to discover, were cruel, and fate, a relentless force, was sharper than any sword. The very next day, as the Khalasar once again rode west, a horrifying event unfolded. Khal Drogo, the invincible Force Lord, fell suddenly from his mount. The wound he had taken days earlier in a petty, insignificant skirmish with a rival, a cut barely worth notice, had festered in the relentless desert heat. Blood and pus now soaked the leather strapping across his massive chest, a sickly, spreading stain. He tried to rise, but his once indomitable body shook violently, betraying him. For the first time, Daenerys saw raw, unadulterated fear in the eyes of men who had never known it, who had always believed their Khal to be invincible. The healers of the Khalasar, wise in their ancient arts, worked tirelessly, chanting and applying their poultices. But Drogo agonizingly grew weaker with each passing dawn. Daenerys, in her fierce love and desperate hope, would not accept it. "There must be another way," she pleaded, her voice steady despite the terrifying tremor that seized her heart. "He is the Khal. His spirit cannot die." An old woman was brought before her then, small and stooped. Mazdor, a Maegi, a god's wife, taken as a slave from one of the villages the Khalasar had brutally burned. Her eyes were deep, black pools of knowing, and her voice, when she spoke, was like smoke curling around ancient secrets. "There are ways," she said softly, her gaze unblinking, "but life must pay for life." Jorah urged extreme caution, his voice heavy with foreboding. But Daenerys' desperate love for Drogo and for their unborn child was stronger than any reason, any warning. "Do what you must," she told the god's wife, her voice firm with resolve. "Save him." As the sun bled crimson across the horizon, Mirri Maz Duur's tent filled with the cloying, unsettling scent of exotic herbs mingling with something darker, something like death. Outside, the Dothraki riders gathered, uneasy and silent, their faces etched with superstitious fear, as the woman's strange chants rose in eerie cadence, and the air around the tent grew thick and heavy with an unseen, palpable power. Daenerys entered the tent only once, compelled by a desperate hope. What she saw there made her blood run cold. Shifting shadows writhed within the flame, a darkness that seemed to breathe, to possess a malevolent life of its own. She fled, terror-stricken, before it could swallow her whole. When the sun rose again, Drogo still lived. But he was not the man he had been. His once fiery eyes were dull and empty, vacant pools reflecting nothing. His breath was shallow, barely a whisper. He did not speak. He did not know her. Daenerys crumpled to her knees, her world shattering around her. "You said you would save him," she whispered, her voice choked with anguish. Mirri Maz Duur offered a smile utterly devoid of warmth, a chilling, triumphant twist of her lips. "He lives? That was your wish, Khaleesi. You asked for life, not for the return of the man he was." Then, with a sickening lurch, Daenerys understood the terrible, twisted price she had paid. And before that night ended, her own agony came upon her. The child she bore, the prophesied stallion who would mount the world, came stillborn. The midwives fled from the tent, screaming in terror. They whispered that the babe had been twisted and scaled like a dragon, with leathery wings and the undeniable mark of death upon him. Daenerys lay in the ashes of her hope, her entire world undone, shattered beyond repair. The riders, gripped by superstition and fear, turned against her, murmuring accusations that she had brought witchcraft and a terrible curse upon them all. Jorah, ever loyal, carried her away from the chaos, his strong arms trembling beneath her devastated weight. By the time the swollen moon rose, painting the plains in silver, she had lost everything she held dear. Drogo's great body sat unmoving beneath the indifferent stars, his magnificent braid uncut, his eyes blank and staring into nothingness. The Khalasar, her people, scattered to the wind, each warrior seeking his own glory, his own path, leaving her utterly alone. Daenerys remained beside him, her heart a raw wound, washing his cold face with her tears. When the inevitable end came, it was she who gave it. An act of profound mercy, she pressed a soft pillow to his chest, whispering words of ancient Dothraki lore, a promise made to the vastness of the heavens. When the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, when the rivers run dry and the mountains blow in the wind like leaves, then you will return to me, my sun and stars. Then gently she closed his vacant eyes and kissed his lips one last time, a farewell to the love that had briefly illuminated her world. The next day, with a quiet, steely resolve born of unimaginable grief, Daenerys ordered a great pyre to be built. They piled it high with fragrant wood and lamp oil, heaping upon it Drogo's most cherished treasures, his riding gear, and the body of his magnificent horse, a final companion. Supreme act of defiant justice, the bound and unrepentant body of Mirri Maz-Dur, the Maegi who had wrought such devastation, was placed at its base. At the very center of the pyre, gleaming like ancient jewels in the fading light, the 3 dragon eggs were carefully positioned. As the stars began their slow, silent wheeling overhead, Daenerys, now naked save for the ashes clinging to her skin, stood before the towering pyre, her eyes fixed on the flames. The wind rose hot and wild, whipping her hair around her face. Mirri Maz-Dur, bound and defiant even in death's shadow, hissed one final venomous warning: "You will not wake the dragon, Khaleesi." Daenerys met her gaze, her voice low, steady, and filled with a power that shook the very air. "I am the dragon," she replied, and then, without hesitation, she stepped into the roaring, hungry flames. The fire, immense and primal, roared like the very breath of the gods. The bewildered Dothraki watchers cried out in terror and awe, but none dared approach the inferno. The pyre burned through the long, dark night, a pillar of incandescent light reaching towards the heavens. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, the ashes still smoked, a testament to the night's impossible events. The remaining men, timid and fearful, cautiously approached, expecting to find only her bones. But Daenerys Targaryen stood alive amid the ruin, miraculously naked and utterly unburned. 3 small shapes clung to her, nestled against her body, one black as midnight, one vibrant green, one shimmering gold. They opened their mouths, tiny yet fierce, and screamed, a sound that pierced the dawn, a sound that split the very sky. The dragons had returned, and in that pivotal moment, across the vast, indifferent sea and across the long, silent years, the world changed once more, irrevocably. The dawn that broke over the red plains of the Dothraki Sea was unlike any in living memory. The very air still trembled with the faint, resonant echo of the dragon's cries, and the sky above the smoldering pyre shimmered with an unearthly light, as if the heavens themselves bore witness to a miraculous birth and a new beginning. Where fire had consumed wood and flesh alike, only ash remained. Ash and a young woman standing unburned within it. Daenerys Targaryen, last of her proud ancient line, daughter of the Mad King, rose from the embers, seemingly crowned in flame itself. Her skin bore no scar, no mark of the inferno. Her silver hair, her distinguishing feature, had been burned away, leaving her stark and reborn. Yet her eyes blazed with an inner light fiercer and more captivating than any fire. Curled protectively against her body were 3 living creatures, their scales glimmering like molten jewels in the nascent light. They were small, no larger than newborn cats, but their miniature wings were already stretching wide as they hissed, tasting the morning air with tiny forked tongues. The black one, Drogon, clung possessively to her shoulder, watching the world with molten obsidian eyes that held ancient wisdom. The green one, Rhaegal, rested against her arm, its claws like polished emerald glass, flexing gently, and the gold one, Viserion, nestled serenely at her breast, breathing softly, a tiny, vibrant heartbeat. Her people, the remnants of the broken Khalasar, the lost and the grieving, fell to their knees as one. None dared speak, only gaze in stunned, reverent silence. In the distant east, it had been prophesied that dragons were gone from the world, that their fire had died with the last of the Targaryens. Yet here they were, undeniably real, reborn from the very ashes of death. Jorah Mormont, the loyal knight who had followed her through fire, grief, and unimaginable loss, took a single slow step forward, then fell to one knee, his head bowed. "Blood of my blood," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My queen." Daenerys looked down upon him, her voice calm, almost distant, yet imbued with an undeniable authority that resonated with the dawn itself. "They will come again, sir," she said, her gaze sweeping across her awestruck followers. "The world will hear the sound of dragons once more." The wind rose again, a gentle, purifying breath, scattering the ashes of the pyre across the land like a benediction, cleansing the earth. The fire had taken everything from her, her husband, her child, her fear, her past self. In their place, it had left only purpose. She was no longer the frightened girl who had crossed the sea under her brother's stifling shadow. She was the blood of the dragon, the unburnt, the mother of dragons, and the world would indeed remember her name. The days that followed were arduous, a testament to the harsh realities of their new existence. The once mighty Khalasar had broken apart after Drogo's fall, splintering into countless fragments. Yet word of the miracle, the impossible rebirth from fire, spread faster than any Dothraki hoofbeat. Riders who had abandoned her, swayed by fear or drawn by insatiable wonder, began to return, their faces a mix of trepidation and awe. They called her Misa, mother of dragons, and where once they had seen only a slave's widow, they now saw a profound sign from the very gods. Under her nascent command, they gathered what little remained of Drogo's scattered people, old men, frail women, wide-eyed children, and the few loyal warriors who still bore her their allegiance. It was a meager following, a ragged, desperate band, but it was a beginning. The dragons grew swiftly, their development astonishing. They were wild and hungry, their haunting cries piercing the vast silence of the night. Daenerys fed them with her own hands, offering them strips of charred meat, speaking to them in the melodic, ancient tongue of Valyria, the language of her blood, the language of dragons. When they looked into her eyes, she saw not untamed beasts, but kin, true and undeniable. They were the last children of fire, just as she was. Jorah, ever cautious, warned her of the perilous path ahead. "The world will come for you now," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "Word will spread, my queen. Every king across the narrow sea will fear what you have birthed. They will send knives and gold alike to see your end." Daenerys smiled faintly, a serene, almost defiant curve of her lips. "Let them come," she replied, her gaze distant, resolute. "I am not my father. I will not burn the world for fear of losing it." Still, she knew that the heavy shadow of her father, King Aerys Targaryen, walked beside her. The memory of his madness, his ultimate ruin, was a ghost she could not banish, a constant reminder of the destructive potential of their lineage. But where he had seen only destruction, she would forge renewal. "Fire and blood," she whispered to herself at night, staring into the impenetrable dark of the Dothraki plains, but not fire alone. They journeyed eastward, a small, determined band, through the cruel, sun-baked and barren desert, a landscape of endless ochre dust and scorching winds, towards the fabled cities of the Free Cities. The land tried to break them, but Daenerys drove her people forward with a will that astonished even her closest followers. At times she felt the nascent fire within her falter, the burden of leadership and the endless hardships weighing heavily, but the dragon's cries, piercing and wild, always rekindled it, strengthening her resolve. They were small still, vulnerable, but when they spread their magnificent leathery wings against the dying light of a desert sunset, she felt the hot, exhilarating breath of destiny upon her cheek. In Qarth, the fabled jewel of the East, a city long known for its lavish wealth and shadowed reputation as a haven of traitors and liars, they found their first true refuge. Its towers rose impossibly high, pale and delicate as carved bone, their gleaming white marble gates intricately carved with wonders, yet also bearing the subtle scars of ancient battles. The 13, the powerful merchant princes who ruled Qarth with silk gloves and iron wills, received her with an outward show of courtesy, their smiles wide but their underlying greed thinly veiled. "You are the last of your kind," they informed her, their voices smooth as polished stone, "but dragons bring both immense wealth and terrible woe. Choose your allies with care, Silver Queen. Daenerys bowed her head, a gesture of deference, but she trusted none of them. Karth, she quickly realized, was a city of masks, and behind every polished smile she saw the same insatiable hunger, the same grasping avarice that had ultimately destroyed her father's court long ago. Still, she played their intricate game, learning what she could, listening more than she spoke, observing the shifting currents of power. Her dragons, thriving in the warmth of Karth's perpetual sun, grew stronger, their wings stretching wider with each passing day. The people of Karth, a curious and acquisitive populace, came in droves to see them, bringing lavish gifts and humble petitions, hoping to bask in her reflected glory. Some knelt in genuine awe, while others plotted in hushed, dangerous whispers. One night, Daenerys stood upon her balcony overlooking the vast, glittering expanse of the Jade Sea. The dragons, her children, rested at her feet, their eyes glowing like embers in the profound darkness. Her mind drifted, pondering the elusive Iron Throne, the throne forged of 1,000 swords. She thought of the wicked blades that had cut her father's hands, of the rivers of blood spilled to win it, of the insidious madness it bred in all who sought to claim it. Was it truly worth reclaiming, this symbol of power and destruction? The question haunted her, a persistent whisper in her soul more acutely than she wished to admit. Yet deep within her heart she knew the truth, a profound, unshakable certainty. The throne was not the ultimate goal, it was merely the means. The broken world her father had so utterly destroyed, she would rebuild. Not through fear and tyranny, but through fire's cleansing, transformative truth. Fire does not only burn, she murmured softly to the silent night, the ancient wisdom resonating within her. It forges. Below her, the dragons stirred, their small, powerful hearts beating in perfect rhythm with her own. Far away, across the sea, in the ancient castle her family had lost, another, more subtle storm was brewing. King Robert's reign waned, his legendary strength fading into the dull stupor of wine and regret. His small council whispered nervously in shadowed corners, their loyalties fraying. His queen's golden children, born of incest and deceit, grew restless beneath their mother's ever-watchful, calculating eye. The realm he had forged with so much blood and rebellion was beginning to crack. Slowly, inexorably, the great wheel of fate, dormant for so long, was indeed turning again. Daenerys looked east, then west, and in both directions she saw a world poised on a precipice, waiting to either burn into oblivion or be remade anew. She raised her hand, a gesture of command and affection, and Drogon, the black dragon, gracefully climbed to her shoulder, settling there with a soft hiss. "Come, my children," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet power. "The world has slept long enough." The majestic beast spread its wings, still growing, and with a cry that echoed across the gleaming marble walls of the city, a sound heard by few since the doom of Valyria, it leapt into the air. The others followed, gold and green, their wings cutting swift, silent arcs through the breaking dawn. The people of Karth, roused from their sleep by the unearthly cries, fell silent in their homes as they watched them rise, a sight unseen in 1,000 years. In that breathtaking moment, the ancient promise of the Targaryens was gloriously reborn, not in madness or tyranny, but in the elemental power of flame and flight. And somewhere deep within the dark, beating heart of Westeros, where the Iron Throne still waited, cold and stark beneath its crown of blades, a chill wind passed through the great hall. The torches flickered wildly, and the shadows danced like spectral firelight upon the steel, for the dragons had truly awakened. And with their return, the world would never, ever be the same again. The heat of Karth was a heavy, suffocating hand upon the throat, a constant, oppressive presence, but Daenerys Targaryen endured it, as she had learned to endure all things. Within the opulent palace, lavishly lent to her by the merchant prince Xaro Shoan Daxos, her dragons grew stronger, larger, and increasingly restless. They hunted shadows across the polished marble floors, their burgeoning wings whispering softly against silk curtains as they tested their developing power. Each day they grew bolder, more confident in their growing strength. The black dragon, Drogon, already began to test his fire, small experimental bursts of flame licking across the strips of meat she gave him. And when his nascent flames danced in the air, men turned their faces away in a mixture of awe and profound, undeniable fear, and she promised her growing dragons, her voice a low murmur that only they seemed to fully comprehend as she fed them tender strips of meat from her own hand. We will cross the world. We will reclaim what was stolen from us. These majestic creatures, however, were born of the wild and the untamed. They knew nothing of the gilded pomp of thrones or the intricate borders of kingdoms. Their fierce primal loyalty belonged solely to the scorching power of fire and to her, the mother who had brought them back into the world. Her human followers, while still few in number, were bound to her with a faith that had been tempered by unimaginable hardship and now seemed unshakable. Among them stood Ser Jorah Mormont, his face a map of grizzled scars and wisdom. He served her with the quiet, steadfast devotion of a man who had wandered lost for years, only to finally discover his true purpose in the radiant light of another. The remaining members of her Khalasar numbered less than 100 souls, women, children, the weak and the weary. Yet to them she was more than a queen. She was Misa, their mother, their protector. They had followed her through the gnawing pangs of hunger, across endless scorching sands, through bitter betrayals and devastating losses. And Daenerys, who had once been little more than a frightened girl, a pawn sold for a crown, now moved among them with the undeniable bearing of a true queen, her every step imbued with burgeoning authority. Yet Qarth, with its opulent courtyards and fragrant gardens, was a viper's nest concealed beneath a veneer of exotic beauty. Danger lurked just beneath its polished surface. The 13th, the city's ruling council, greeted her with smiles that felt colder and sharper than the keenest blades, their eyes betraying a predatory assessment. "A dragon queen without ships or soldiers is but a dream," declared the pureborn of the city, their pristine robes white as freshly mined salt, stark against their self-important faces. Their voices were laden with dismissive scorn. "And a dream, my lady, cannot conquer a kingdom." Daenerys lowered her head, a gesture of seeming deference, but within her a fierce, defiant fire burned, untouched by their arrogance. "Dreams made this world once," she confided to Ser Jorah later that night, after they had left the great hall and its mocking echoes, "and dreams will make it anew." Still, she possessed the clarity to acknowledge the harsh truth in their words. Without a fleet of ships, crossing the vast sea was an impossibility. Without an army, reclaiming her ancestral birthright, the Iron Throne, was a mere fantasy. The Iron Throne in that moment might as well have been placed on the distant moon for all its attainability. As weeks bled into one another, she tirelessly sought allies among Qarth's wealthy merchants and enigmatic warlocks. Aroshon Daxos, a powerful and charming merchant, professed himself her devoted friend, filling her ears with a torrent of soft, enticing promises. "Marry me, Daenerys Stormborn," he proposed one night, his voice a silken whisper as they strolled through moonlit gardens where pale, ghostly flowers bloomed only in the profound darkness. "Share my house, and all my immense wealth shall be yours. I will give you ships, enough gold to fill a dragon's hoard, and guards sufficient to shake the very foundations of the world." But Daenerys, hardened by experience, had learned to see far beyond such gilded words, beyond the glittering veneer of his offer. She discerned the raw hunger in his eyes, a lust not for her body, but for the magnificent, terrifying dragon she carried as her future. "You are kind," she replied, her voice cool and clear as polished glass, her gaze unwavering. "But I am already wed to fire and to destiny." Zaro laughed, though the sound held no genuine mirth, only a chilling, knowing edge. "Dreams do not fill the belly, my queen. Beware that your fire does not burn you as it burned your father." At the chilling mention of her father, King Aerys, her heart clenched, a spasm of icy dread. The searing memory of his madness, the deafening screams, the apocalyptic green wildfire that had consumed King's Landing, the utter ruin of her ancient house. It all still haunted her waking hours and twisted her dreams. In every flicker of her dragon's nascent flames, she heard the spectral echo of his insane laughter. Yet, she vowed with a fierce, unwavering resolve, she would not become him. She had promised herself that, a sacred oath whispered in the deepest chambers of her soul. The warlocks of Qarth, however, were a different breed of menace. They approached her in unsettling silence, their skin as pale and translucent as ghosts, their lips stained a vivid, unnatural blue from the potent drink they called Shade of the Evening. They spoke in hushed, mesmerizing tones of immense power and ancient prophecy, of visions that stretched far beyond the limited scope of mortal sight. "Come to the house of the undying," they urged, their voices like dry whispers carried on a desert wind. "There you will see what was, what is, and what shall be." Against Ser Jorah's earnest and cautious counsel, a defiant, curious Daenerys went. She entered the towering fortress of the Warlocks, her 3 young dragons perched bravely upon her shoulders, their tiny claws digging into her flesh. Her heart remained surprisingly steady, despite the palpable dread that clung to her like a suffocating shroud. The air within was eerily strange, thick with the phantom echoes of whispers, and the very walls seemed to writhe and shift like sentient mist. She walked through an impossible maze of halls that folded back upon themselves, where every shadow seemed to possess a sinister, living sentience. Visions, vivid and unsettling, came to her in the flickering, ephemeral firelight. She saw her elder brother, Rhaegar, a figure she had never truly known, standing beside a woman with a babe cradled tenderly in her arms. "There must be one more," he said softly, his voice a gentle, haunting whisper across time. "The dragon has 3 heads." His eyes, ancient and knowing, met hers, and though she had never truly known him, tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her own. She saw when she finally emerged from the House of the Undying, her dragon shrieking with a primal, triumphant fury around her. The ancient, ominous structure was ablaze, consumed by an inferno. Whether the Daenerys, you must, the gold, as her others, the salt, she thought, but the fire ahead, they were the, and she had, but to, before, when they, one day, the very markets surge, if they pretend, he spoke, she, all, at last, the good, the slave, didn't. The man froze, the color draining from his face as the horrifying realization dawned upon him that she had understood every vile, insulting word he had spoken. "You," he stammered, his bravado crumbling into dust. "Drogon," she commanded softly, her voice barely a whisper, yet infused with an undeniable authority that resonated through the very air. The black dragon opened its massive jaws, and a torrent of fire, roaring and consuming, filled the entire plaza. The air itself seemed to scream in agony. Krasnys died before he could even attempt to run, his expensive silks turning to ash in an instant, his flesh searing away. The other masters followed, their panicked cries utterly lost in the deafening roar of the flames. Daenerys turned to the 10,000 Unsullied, her voice rising clear and strong above the remaining chaos. "Slaves you were," she cried, her voice ringing with liberation. "But now you are free. Will you fight for me as free men?" The vast army stood utterly still, like statues carved of obsidian. Then, as one, they struck their spears upon the ground with a thunderous impact that rolled across the city like a seismic tremor. "Misa!" the newly freed slaves shouted, their voices unified in a guttural tongue Daenerys did not yet fully know, but whose meaning she understood perfectly. "Mother!" When the acrid smoke finally cleared, the proud banners of Astapor burned fiercely upon their towering pyramids, and the city's red bricks ran dark with the spilled blood of its cruel slavers. Daenerys rode triumphantly through the stunned streets with her dragons circling majestically above, their shadows dancing on the cobbled lanes, and the kneeling people, their faces a mixture of fear and burgeoning hope, bowed before her. "See, Jorah," she said softly, turning to her loyal knight. "Fire can destroy, but it can also cleanse." He bowed his grizzled head, his expression solemn. "So it can, your grace, but fire does not choose whom it burns. It is a terrible master." Her army, now an unstoppable force, marched northward toward Yunkai, another city built upon the backs of chains. Word of the Dragon Queen, the breaker of chains, spread like wildfire before them. The masters of Yunkai, now trembling, offered her vast quantities of gold and a fragile peace if she would simply bypass their city. She refused, her conviction resolute. "No city shall stand upon the backs of slaves while I draw breath." Her Unsullied, moving with perfect, terrifying unity, struck swift and sure. The formidable walls of Yunkai fell, its gates thrown open from within by those who had once been bound in shackles. When Daenerys entered, thousands upon thousands gathered around her, their faces upturned, a sea of hope and desperation. They called her Mhisa again, their voices ringing with adoration, reaching out to touch her hands, her cloak, even the very hem of her gown as if she were a living goddess. She looked upon their faces, hopeful, desperate, utterly reliant, and something profound shifted within her heart. These were not her subjects by blood or by birthright, yet they were hers all the same. She had freed them. She had given them more than mere life. She had given them the precious gift of hope. And in their adoring eyes, she saw her true purpose take undeniable form, not merely to reclaim a distant throne of cold blades, but to shatter the very chains of a world built upon cruelty and fell. She dreamed of the desolate Iron Throne, of her father's chilling laughter echoing through halls consumed by mad green fire. He thought he was cleansing, she whispered to Jorah one night as the campfires burned low, casting long, dancing shadows. He thought his fire was just. "Your father was mad, Your Grace," Jorah replied gently, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. "You are not." "But he was my blood," she murmured, her voice laced with a primal fear. Madness runs deep in dragons. Jorah knelt before her, his scarred face solemn and sincere. "Then be the first to tame it, Khaleesi." In Meereen, the last and greatest of the slaver cities, her army met its fiercest, most horrifying trial. The masters, in an act of sickening defiance, had crucified slave children along the entire road leading to their massive gates, a grotesque line of agony stretching for miles, each small, broken body bearing a sign. This is what comes of defiance. Daenerys' fury was not a wild, screaming rage. It was a quiet, glacial thing, cold and inexorable as the heart of a blue flame. "For every child they have killed," she declared, her voice unnaturally calm, her eyes burning with an ancient wrath, "a master will hang upon a cross." When Meereen eventually fell, her banners, emblazoned with the three-headed dragon, rose majestically over its towering pyramids, and her chilling justice was meticulously, terrifyingly done. The chains that had bound generations were broken, the cruel whips cast down into the dust. The freedmen, their voices echoing with newfound liberation, sang her name through the labyrinthine streets. Yet the hard-won peace brought her no rest. Ruling, she quickly discovered, was a heavier, more complex crown than conquest. Her diverse advisors quarreled incessantly. Her new subjects, still reeling from generations of oppression, hungered for stability, and her enemies, unseen and insidious, gathered like vultures beyond the city walls, waiting for a moment of weakness. Each choice she made seemed to birth 10 more, each fraught with unforeseen consequences. Some nights she stood upon the high, windswept balcony of her palace, watching her magnificent dragons soar through the smoke-reddened sky. Their wild, fierce cries echoed hauntingly over the bay, untamed and powerful. Below, the sprawling city she had claimed stirred and simmered like a vast, volatile cauldron, always threatening to boil over. "Am I my father's daughter?" she whispered to the indifferent wind, her voice raw with doubt. "Or something new entirely?" No answer came, only the rhythmic beating of her dragon's colossal wings. Still, deep within her heart, the fire burned bright and unwavering. She would not be her father's ruinous legacy, nor her brother's foolish, tragic folly. She would be the dragon that remade the fractured world. The city of Meereen rose from the red dust of the Slaver's Bay like a multifaceted jewel, carved from ancient blood and raw, defiant flame. But to Daenerys Targaryen, it was rapidly becoming a gilded prison, its golden splendor a cruel mockery of her captivity. The city walls stood impossibly high, their bricks painted with vibrant, boastful scenes of conquest and long-forgotten glory. Yet, beneath their imposing shadow, the streets seethed with an undercurrent of unrest and simmering resentment. The masters were broken, the slaves freed, and still the oppressive air reeked of lingering fear, distrust, and the constant threat of rebellion. She had arrived as a conqueror, but now she was forced to rule as a queen, and ruling, she learned with a crushing weight, was the cruelest, most relentless war of all. Each morning brought an endless procession of petitions to her makeshift throne, a simple seat of carved wood placed beneath the majestic dome of the Great Pyramid. Freedmen begged for immediate justice for past wrongs. Former masters, now reduced to pleading, groveled for mercy and forgiveness, and the hungry, their bellies aching, cried out endlessly for bread, for sustenance. Her decrees, meant to bring order and fairness, rippled through the volatile city like an uncontrolled fire through dry grass, consuming everything in their path. For every wrong she diligently righted, 3 new unforeseen problems seemed to spring up in its place. The people continued to call her Mhaisa, mother, but even the deepest love could curdle and turn to wrath when bellies remained empty and the few precious coins ran thin. Her weary council, led by Ser Jorah, urged her repeatedly to abandon the turbulent city and resume her westward march. "You have your army, your grace," Ser Jorah implored, his voice heavy with concern. "You have your dragons, the Iron Throne waits. Let these people rule themselves or suffer their own fate." But Daenerys shook her head, her resolve unyielding. "If I cannot rule one city without chains or fear, how can I ever hope to rule 7 kingdoms?" She countered, her voice ringing with conviction. "I will not leave Meereen to rot and descend into chaos behind me." So she stayed, and the endless stifling days bled into one another beneath the merciless burning sun. Her dragons, now vast beyond belief, grew wilder and more untamed with each passing week, their colossal wings darkening the sky as they soared overhead. They hunted far beyond the city walls, preying on goats, horses, and terrifyingly even men. Gun, the largest and blackest of them all, grew the fiercest, his fire turning night to day with terrifying ease. The whispers began among the fearful populace that he was her father, the Mad King, reborn. And in their rising fear, they began to curse the very name of their queen. Heartbroken, she ordered chains forged for her 2 lesser dragons, Viserion and Rhaegal, locking them deep beneath the Great Pyramid, where their mournful, guttural roars shook the very stone foundations of the ancient structure. But Drogon, wild and independent, could not be bound. He vanished, a black shadow disappearing into the vast, unforgiving deserts, leaving only a trail of scorched earth in his wake. That night, Daenerys wept openly, her grief raw and profound, as she listened to the heart-wrenching cries of her chained children echo through the silent halls of her palace. "Forgive me," she whispered into the darkness, tears streaming down her face. "You are my children, but I am their queen, and their people are my responsibility." No answer came, only the chilling, mournful sound of colossal claws scraping against cold stone. Her heart grew heavy with doubt, a leaden weight in her chest. The immense burdens of rule pressed upon her, crushing her spirit like bands of iron. The Sons of the Harpy, a clandestine brotherhood of the old disgruntled masters, rose in open rebellion, striking lethally from the shadows. Freedmen and former slaves, their fragile peace shattered, turned against one another, and the narrow streets of Meereen ran dark with their blood. "You cannot make peace with those who only remember power, my queen," advised Daario Naharis, her charismatic captain, a sellsword with eyes like molten gold and a smile as sharp and dangerous as polished steel. "Cut off their heads, my queen, and give the rest to the dragons. That is the way of power." But Daenerys had already witnessed far too much death, far too much casual brutality. "If I rule by fear alone," she stated, her voice trembling slightly, "I am my father's daughter." Still, each new day brought fresh terror as the Harpies struck again. Their unseen knives found her loyal soldiers in dark alleys, her diligent servants in the bustling market, her wise counselors in their very beds. Her people, terrified and enraged, cried out for swift vengeance, and Daenerys felt the ancient fire, dormant but potent, rise fiercely in her blood. One dawn, her resolve hardened into unyielding steel. She rode through the silent streets of Meereen on a majestic white mare, her loyal guards riding close behind. The people watched from shadowed doorways and precarious rooftops, some with a reverence bordering on awe, others with unconcealed hatred and simmering resentment. At the Grand Plaza, where slaves had once been bought and sold like cattle, she halted and spoke, her voice carrying through the still pre-dawn air with undeniable authority. "You cry for peace," she declared, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "Then lay down your knives. The past is ashes. Build a new world, and I will stand with you." No voice answered, only the mournful whisper of the wind moving through the deserted square. That very night, they found another of her unsullied soldiers slain, his throat slit, a grotesque harpy's mask nailed mockingly above his corpse. Daenerys closed her eyes and felt the searing heat of an unbridled rage surge beneath her skin. For the first time, she truly understood the terrifying allure of the madness her father had known, the seductive, whispering promise that offered an immediate, absolute end to all rebellion, all dissent, through the annihilating power of flame. But where Aerys had been utterly ruled by his fire, she, Daenerys Stormborn, would rule hers. "Bring the guilty to me," she commanded her guards, her voice devoid of emotion, hard as dragon glass. "And bring the dragons." When morning broke, she held her grim court before the towering pyramid. The Harpy sons were dragged forth, their masks violently torn away. Some were undoubtedly guilty, some perhaps not. But the entire city watched in absolute, terrifying silence as she, Daenerys Targaryen, pronounced her unwavering judgment. The dragon's fire, a cleansing, terrible inferno, purged the square. It was over in mere moments, but the echoing screams lingered long after the flames subsided, a haunting testament to her wrath. Afterward, she walked alone upon the high terrace, her face turned toward the distant, shimmering sea. Daario found her there, a solitary figure, the wind playfully tugging at her silver hair. "Mercy and justice rarely walk the same road, my queen," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. "I know," she answered, her voice barely a whisper, laden with the weight of her choice. "But if I lose one, I fear I lose myself entirely." Beyond Meereen, the storm began to gather once more, a dark, ominous tempest on the horizon. The very slave cities she had so recently freed now turned against her, corrupted by fear and the lure of old power. Yunkai and Astapor rose anew, their banners proclaiming vengeance against the Dragon Queen. Their armies, formidable and vengeful, marched relentlessly toward her walls, and their fleets of ships now blockaded her vital harbor, cutting off all supplies. Disease, a silent, insidious killer, stalked the crowded streets, and famine, its cruel companion, followed closely in its wake, gnawing at the city's spirit. Her council, now desperate, begged her to flee, to abandon Meereen to its grim fate. But Daenerys, her spirit unbowed, refused. "I will not run from the world I mean to change," she declared, her voice ringing with defiance. "If I am to be queen, I must face what queens are born to face, all of it without faltering." When the inevitable battle finally came, it arrived swiftly and mercilessly, a maelstrom of violence. The sky above Meereen filled with acrid smoke and the frantic screams of gulls. The thunderous drums of war boomed relentlessly beyond the massive gates, a chilling heartbeat of impending doom. The unsullied, disciplined, and unyielding held the walls with unshakable courage, but the tide of enemies, seemingly endless, threatened to overwhelm them. Then, in the midst of the chaos and despair, a primal cry split the smoke-filled air. Drogon had returned! He burst from the bruised clouds like a shadow from the old world, a colossal, terrifying presence, his black wings spreading wide, fire pure and devastating pouring from his immense jaws. The enemy lines, once so confident, broke instantly beneath his wrath, their ranks scattering in utter blind terror. Meereen's valiant defenders fell to their knees, tears streaming down their soot-stained faces, crying her name in a chorus of relief and awe. Daenerys herself ran, heedless of the danger, toward the fiery field, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When Drogon, magnificent and terrible, landed directly before her, his wild, proud, terrifying eyes met hers in a moment of profound, unspoken connection. She stepped forward without a hint of fear, drawn by an irresistible force. "I am no slave to destiny," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound power, "but neither will I flee it." With a leap of pure faith, she climbed upon his scaly, burning back. The colossal beast shuddered once, a ripple of immense power. Then, with a mighty roar, he leapt skyward, the wind tearing at her silver hair, a queen astride her dragon. Below her, the entire world seemed to fall away into a distant blur. The besieged city, the brutal war, the crushing chains of expectation, all vanished. The vast, embracing sky swallowed her whole, and for the first time since the scorching inferno that birthed her dragons, she felt utterly, truly free. They flew far beyond the battle-scarred Meereen, past the smoking battlefields, over shining, winding rivers, out into the endless, desolate expanse of the Red Waste. Days blurred into nights marked only by the sun's relentless passage. Hunger and thirst gnawed at her, raw and persistent. But the primal fire within her, the very essence of her being, sustained her, keeping her spirit alive. When at last Drogon, with a gentle grace that belied his fearsome size, set her down upon a lonely, windswept plain, she slept beside him, a queen and her dragon, dreaming of dragons yet unborn and kingdoms yet to fall under her unwavering gaze. When she awoke, the rising sun painting the sky in fiery hues, riders surrounded her, hard men clad in leather and gleaming bronze, their faces weathered and stern, faces she knew from another life. Another Khalasar had found her, their banners emblazoned with a horse snapping fiercely in the hot desert wind. Daenerys rose, regal and defiant, her magnificent dragon, Drogon, a colossal, intimidating shadow at her back. The Dothraki warriors stared, half in awe, half in profound, primal fear, their fierce eyes wide. The leader dismounted and approached, a scarred giant of a man with eyes like dark, polished stone, his presence radiating raw power. He looked at the woman who had tamed fire itself, who rode a creature of myth, and smiled grimly. "You are no slave," he stated, his voice a gravelly rumble. "You are Khaleesi." Daenerys stood tall and proud, the blazing sun illuminating her silver hair like a crown of spun moonlight, her dragon's immense shadow stretching long and dark across the shimmering sands, a harbinger of untold power. "No," she corrected him, her voice strong and clear, resonating with an ancient authority. "I am queen." And as Drogon let loose a deafening roar that shook the very heavens, the vast grasslands trembled beneath her feet, acknowledging her dominion. The fire of the Targaryens, ancient and formidable, had at last returned to the world, and its fierce flame would not be quenched again. The wind that swept across the vast Dothraki sea smelled of ancient dust and a vibrant, boundless promise. The tall golden grass bent and swayed like powerful waves before the majestic flight of the dragon, its immense shadow gliding effortlessly, silently across the boundless land. The Dothraki riders followed that awe-inspiring shadow, shouting to one another, their curved arcs raised high, their fierce eyes bright with a mixture of fear and profound wonder. No Khal had ever ridden such a beast. No woman had ever commanded such raw, undeniable power. There she stood, small and bright beneath the vast, indifferent sun, her hair silver as winter frost, her eyes like twin amethysts burning with an inner heat. Daenerys Targaryen, the last brave scion of her ancient house, looked upon the gathered Khalasar and felt the old forgotten name of her blood stir once more, a powerful awakening. The very air shimmered around her with the intense radiating heat of the dragon, and every breath she drew was imbued with the acrid scent of smoke and the vivid, haunting echoes of memory. She had crossed the Doth. "A woman in the wild with a monster for a steed," he sneered, his voice dripping with scorn. "You should have stayed in your city of stone, little queen." Daenerys lifted her head, her gaze meeting his, unflinching. "I was the—" When he reached out, a massive hand intending to seize her, Drogon's earth-shattering roar split the very sky. The Dothraki horses screamed in terror and scattered wildly. Moro stumbled back, his infamous courage melting like snow in the dragon's fire as the immense, terrifying shadow of Drogon fell directly over him, eclipsing the sun. Flames, hot and hungry, licked the very air around them, dancing dangerously close. Daenerys, standing tall and utterly fearless, simply raised her hand, a gesture of command both ancient and absolute. "Fire is mine," she stated, her voice imbued with the power of ages. "Bend the knee or burn." And one by one, his 10,000 fierce riders, their expressions a mixture of fear, awe, and grudging respect, followed suit. 10,000 hardened warriors bowed before the queen with the formidable dragon at her back. In that electrifying moment, the ancient, glorious song of her house, the Targaryen house, rose again upon the wind, stronger and more resonant than ever before. The years that followed were years of intense, relentless forging. The wild, untamed Dothraki became her mighty cavalry, their loyalty now absolute. The unsullied, disciplined, and unyielding became her unbreakable shield, an impenetrable wall of spears. and the newly freed men and women of Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor, their spirits soaring with hope, swelled her formidable ranks, forming a true army of liberation. The immense undertaking began. Yards hummed with industry, new vessels rising from the timber, their hulls broad and sturdy, designed for the perilous crossing of the narrow sea. Sails, woven thick and strong, were hoisted high, eager to billow with the western winds that would carry them to a forgotten homeland. All the while the dragons grew, each day larger, more magnificent, and terrifyingly powerful. Drogon, a colossal shadow, his scales the deepest black, his roar a thunder that shook the very foundations of the earth. Viserion, spectral and gleaming, his hide the pale hue of winter sunlight, a living torch in the skies. And Rhaegal, verdant as the deepest ocean trench, his wings beating a rhythm that resonated with ancient power. When they soared together, their combined majesty was a sight that stole breath and silenced fear, but also ignited a primal terror in the hearts of those who witnessed it. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their fierce presence, the very land beneath them trembling, yet true power was never synonymous with peace. In the liberated cities of Essos, Daenerys left behind a fragile peace, her name now a prayer on the lips of the freed, but a curse whispered in the shadows by those who resented her disruptions. Whispers spoke of a queen of fire, a breaker of chains and enslavers, yes, but also a destroyer of established order, a queen who had burned kings and dissolved ancient thrones with ruthless efficiency. Her wake was a storm, both cleansing and destructive, and her nascent empire, though vast, was held together by her formidable will and the terrifying presence of her dragons, not by the peaceful consent of all its varied peoples. Across the narrow sea and the seven kingdoms of Westeros, word of her growing might and her dragon's return had already sown seeds of unease. The great lords, haunted by the specter of her father's madness and the horrors of his reign, shuddered at the thought of another Targaryen on the Iron Throne. To some, particularly the downtrodden and the disillusioned, she was a messianic figure, a promised salvation against tyranny. To others, she was nothing less than the shadow of doom reborn, a firestorm destined to engulf their world once more. The day of departure arrived, heralded by a dawn of dramatic purple and gold. Daenerys Targaryen stood upon the ornate prow of her flagship, the Queen's Fury, the salt spray misting her face as she gazed westward, where the horizon blurred into a promise. Round her, her grand banners, the fearsome three-headed dragon, black on a field of blood red, snapped and billowed like living beasts, proclaiming her dominion to the heavens. The sea, vast and alive, was a shimmering tapestry of sails. 1,000 ships, their canvas full and bright, stretching as far as the eye could see, a fleet truly worthy of a conqueror. The air thrummed with the anticipation of war and destiny. "Your Grace," Tyrion Lannister, ever the sardonic advisor, joined her, his voice a low rumble above the churning waves. "The winds are with us. Westeros lies ahead." Daenerys turned her gaze from the vast expanse of ocean to the dwarf by her side, then back west and towards the land of her birth, a land she had only ever known in dreams and whispered stories. "Then we sail for home," she declared, her voice filled with a quiet, resolute power. The journey was long and arduous, stretching across many grueling months. The sea, indifferent to their grand ambitions, thrashed and raged, storms tearing at their sails, threatening to splinter their grand fleet into kindling. Fear began to eat at the men, and whispers of ancient omens, malevolent spirits, and ill-fated journeys spread like contagion through the lower decks. Yet Daenerys remained unshaken, a beacon of unyielding will. High above the tempest-tossed waves, the dragons flew, their mighty wings parting the storm clouds, their roars echoing like a celestial defiance, warding off both the fury of the squalls and the encroaching fear in the hearts of her weary armada. They were her living shields, her unwavering guardians. At last, through a shroud of sea mist, the emerald cliffs of Dragonstone rose into view, a jagged silhouette against the gray sky. Daenerys's heart tightened in her chest, a profound mixture of anticipation and melancholy. This stark volcanic isle was where she had been born amidst the chaos of a raging storm and the shadow of death, her mother succumbing in childbirth. Now she returned not as a frightened babe, but as a queen, a conqueror come to reclaim her birthright, her destiny forged in fire and blood. The castle itself stood stark and proud upon its black volcanic rock, its forbidding towers sculpted by ancient Valyrian magic to resemble the spines and wings of slumbering dragons. The air within its desolate halls was thick with the scent of salt and ash, a potent blend of the sea's wild breath and the ghosts of memories long buried. Every corridor, every chamber seemed to echo with a past that was both glorious and tragic. As she walked the ancient, worn paths of Dragonstone, her footsteps, light yet firm, resonated through the desolate chambers once trod by her mercurial father and her ill-fated brother. Before the cavernous, cold hearth in the great hall, she paused, her hand brushing against the soot-stained stones. "Father," she whispered into the silence, her voice barely audible above the distant roar of the sea. "You sought to rule through fear and fire. I will rule through fire and justice." As if in response to her profound vow, the languid flames in the hearth suddenly surged, leaping higher, their orange glow momentarily banishing the oppressive shadows. It was a potent, silent acknowledgement of her declaration, a fiery promise against the chill of history. Outside, the unrelenting sea continued to beat a ceaseless rhythm against the black cliffs, a primal drumbeat signaling her arrival. Faster than dragons could fly, ravens black as night carried word across the realm. The Dragon Queen had come. In King's Landing, hundreds of miles to the west, the Iron Throne, a jagged monstrosity forged from the swords of vanquished enemies, sat cold and unyielding beneath its crown of razor-sharp blades. Cersei Lannister, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, now occupied that precarious seat, her rule built not on the fragile trust of her subjects, but on a foundation of ash cunning and the poisoned whispers of her court. When the tidings of Daenerys' arrival reached her, a thin, chilling smile touched Cersei's lips, though her eyes remained hard and glittering like shards of shattered glass. "Let her come," she said, her voice dripping with venomous confidence. "We shall see if her fire burns hotter than mine." The implicit threat of her own ruthless tactics, her wildfire, hung heavy in the air. Far in the desolate north, beyond the treacherous rivers and jagged mountains, Jon Snow stood solitary upon the frost-rimmed battlements of Winterfell. He gazed south, a somber figure against the vast, empty sky. The wind that whipped around him, sharp and biting, carried the faintest, almost imperceptible scent of salt from a distant sea and the ghost of smoke. And though he, the silent watcher, could not possibly know the full implications, the intricate wheel of fate had begun its inexorable turn. For the ancient forces of ice and fire embodied in these two formidable leaders were now irrevocably moving toward each other, drawn by a bond far older and more profound than any king or queen. Upon Dragonstone's highest, most windswept tower, Daenerys stood, her gaze sweeping across the vast, churning sea she had now, in a sense, conquered. Beside her, a colossal, magnificent presence, Drogon perched, his immense weight shaking the very stones beneath them. His eyes, molten gold, pulsed and glowed like banked embers in the dim light. She reached out, her hand resting against the warm, rough scales of his neck, a comforting weight that anchored her to the present. "We have come far," she murmured, her voice a soft sigh against the rising wind. "But the true war lies ahead." Drogon rumbled low in his chest, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through her, as if he understood the weight of her words, the enormity of the coming struggle. In that profound quiet, surrounded by the ghosts of her ancestors and the promise of her future, she reflected upon the long, arduous road that had brought her to this ancient familial seat, the searing ashes of her father's madness, the insatiable greed of her brother, the paradoxical fire that had both cursed and profoundly blessed her bloodline. All had converged to shape the queen she was now. She thought of the countless slaves she had liberated, the men she had judged and justly burned, the powerful cities she had broken and rebuilt in her image. Her heart, heavy with the myriad memories, both triumphant and sorrowful, still held steady, the flame within her spirit burning unwavering, a constant beacon of her relentless will. "The world will remember," she said softly, her voice gaining strength, carried by the rising wind. Not the mad king, not the beggar prince, but the queen who walked through fire and was not consumed. The wind rose further, sweeping her defiant words into the deepening twilight. Below her, on the dark, rugged shore, her vast armies gathered, their countless torches flickering like constellations, bright against the encroaching night. Above her, the magnificent forms of her dragons turned their vast, leathery wings toward the west, their instincts guiding them toward the coming conflict. And then the dawn broke, pale and cold and breathtakingly beautiful upon the churning sea. It gleamed, a nascent light, upon her proud banners, upon the resolute fire in her eyes, upon the very blade of destiny itself waiting to be wielded. And thus the epic story of the Mad King's lineage had in an echoing and violent fashion come full circle, from the terrifying madness of Aerys II to the ashes of his fallen house, and from those very ashes, a flame reborn. The world that had believed the dragons gone forever, relegated to myth and legend, would soon learn otherwise, brutally and irrevocably. For Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, the last Targaryen, had indeed come to claim her father's realm, not with the debilitating madness that consumed him, but with a calculated, unwavering, and cleansing fire. And the earth-shattering sound of her dragon's cries, carried on the very winds of destiny, heralded not merely her arrival, but the ferocious, undeniable beginning of a new age, the age of fire and blood once again. And that is the tragic story of Aerys II Targaryen, the Mad King, a ruler whose paranoia, obsession with fire, and fear of betrayal ultimately destroyed his own dynasty and plunged Westeros into rebellion. From a promising young king to a tyrant remembered only for the chilling command, "Burn them all," his fall marked the end of an era, and unknowingly set the stage for the return of dragons through Daenerys Targaryen. But now we want to hear from you. What do you think about the story of the Mad King? Was Aerys always destined to become a monster? Or could history have been different if things had gone another way? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your opinion. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.